Some discoveries seem to arrive without a place in the story we know. A carved stone with an uncertain purpose, a burial unlike its neighbors, an artifact shaped with remarkable precision. Each can open a trail of evidence leading into deeper uncertainty. For 3 hours, we'll explore remarkable archaeological finds that continue to challenge interpretation. So, settle in, stay curious, and let's begin. In the highlands of central Turkey, where ridges of pale volcanic rock rise above wooded valleys, an unusual landscape unfolds. Cliffs have been carved into facades. Slopes conceal rock-cut chambers, and ancient pathways wind between monuments that seem inseparable from the stone itself. This is the Phrygian Valley, a broad archaeological landscape associated with the Phrygian people, whose culture flourished in central Anatolia during the early 1st millennium BC. The region is not a single ruined city, but a network of settlements, sanctuaries, tombs, inscriptions, and monumental rock formations extending across parts of modern Afyonkarahisar, Eskişehir, and Kütahya provinces. Among its most remarkable features are the rock-cut monuments around Yazilikaya, including the celebrated Midas Monument, a monumental facade carved directly into a towering rock face. At first glance, the structure resembles the entrance to a temple. Its geometric patterns, recessed panels, and carefully arranged surfaces suggest deliberate architectural planning. Yet there was never a conventional building standing behind the facade. The monument is essentially architecture transformed into stone relief, a sacred appearance created without constructing walls in the usual sense. Its connection with the Phrygian world is well established, although the popular association with King Midas requires some caution. Midas was a historical Phrygian ruler remembered through later Greek traditions, but the monument itself does not necessarily represent a palace or royal tomb. Archaeological evidence instead points toward a religious function, possibly connected with the worship of the Phrygian mother goddess, commonly identified as Matar. Nearby, other rock-cut sanctuaries and inscriptions reveal how deeply the Phrygians interacted with their landscape. Some monuments appear to imitate wooden or masonry architecture. Others contain niches, stepped surfaces, channels, or enigmatic markings whose exact ritual significance remains uncertain. And this is where the valley begins to become especially intriguing. Why did the Phrygians invest so much effort in carving monumental forms into isolated cliffs rather than building conventional structures on the ground? Was the mountain itself regarded as part of the sacred architecture? Could these places have represented gateways between the human world and a divine realm? Mainstream archaeology generally places these monuments within the religious and cultural traditions of Iron Age Anatolia. Their designs can be compared with known Phrygian artistic conventions, while inscriptions and excavated material help establish their approximate chronology and purpose. Yet, interpretation becomes more difficult when the physical landscape is considered as a whole. The valleys contain numerous caves, terraces, rock-cut chambers, and formations whose original functions are not always obvious. Some may have served practical purposes. Others were probably associated with ritual activity. Still others have suffered erosion, later modification, or centuries of reuse, making their earliest roles difficult to reconstruct. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some writers have proposed that the valleys formed an enormous ceremonial complex whose significance extended far beyond individual monuments. Others have suggested that certain carvings may encode astronomical or symbolic knowledge. More adventurous theories have even imagined the landscape as evidence of a forgotten technological tradition. There is little solid evidence supporting such extraordinary claims, and archaeologists generally favor explanations rooted in Phrygian religion, funerary customs, craftsmanship, and the political world of Iron Age Anatolia. Yet, speculation persists because the landscape itself is so unusual. Standing before one of these enormous facades, the distinction between natural cliff and human construction becomes difficult to separate. The rock appears ancient, immovable, almost timeless, yet its surface carries unmistakable traces of deliberate human design. Perhaps that was precisely the intention. The Phrygians did not simply build upon the landscape. They transformed the landscape into architecture, giving mountains, cliffs, and caves roles within a sacred world whose full meaning has not survived. And as researchers continue tracing inscriptions, studying the monuments, and reconstructing the rituals that once took place here, one question remains quietly present. How much of the Phrygian Valley's original story is still concealed within the stone? From the carved cliffs of the Phrygian Valley, our journey now moves toward a landscape where the mystery is visible on a scale almost impossible to appreciate from the ground. Deep within Mauritania's Sahara, an enormous circular formation stretches across the desert like a vast stone eye. Known as the Richat structure, or the Eye of the Sahara, it measures roughly 40 kilometers across. From above, its concentric ridges form sweeping rings of sandstone and rock, rising and falling across an otherwise immense expanse of arid terrain. For generations, the formation was difficult to recognize as a single geological feature. From the surface, its enormous scale obscures the pattern. It was the arrival of aerial photography and satellite imagery that revealed the remarkable geometry, a series of broad circles nested within one another, creating an appearance so precise that it seemed almost architectural. What could produce something on such a scale? The scientific explanation begins deep in geological time. Researchers generally interpret the Richat structure as a heavily eroded geological dome. Layers of sedimentary rock were uplifted, fractured, and subsequently exposed to weathering. Over immense periods, erosion removed softer materials more rapidly than resistant rock, gradually emphasizing the alternating ridges and depressions that now create the circular pattern. The structure is therefore not generally considered the remains of a constructed monument. Geological studies have identified different rock types within the formation, including quartzite and sedimentary layers, while evidence of igneous activity and hydrothermal processes has also contributed to its complex history. But the Richat structure remains visually unsettling because its form appears so deliberate. The rings are not perfectly symmetrical. They are interrupted, irregular, and shaped by natural geological processes. Yet, from high above, their arrangement creates an almost monumental impression. Was this simply the result of erosion acting upon a pre-existing geological structure? Or could unusual forces have contributed to its distinctive appearance? This question has attracted interpretations far beyond conventional geology. One of the most persistent ideas connects the formation with Atlantis. Because Plato described Atlantis as being associated with concentric rings of land and water, some speculative writers have argued that the Richat structure might represent the remains of that legendary city. The resemblance is visually compelling at first glance, particularly when satellite images are viewed without geological context. Yet, there is no accepted archaeological evidence demonstrating that Atlantis existed at this location, and the Richat structure does not correspond closely enough to Plato's account to establish such a connection. Other theories have suggested that ancient people may have used the formation as a landmark, ceremonial landscape, or center of activity. This possibility is more grounded. Humans have occupied and traveled through the Sahara for thousands of years, particularly during periods when the region experienced a much wetter climate. Archaeological evidence from the broader Sahara demonstrates that prehistoric communities lived, hunted, and moved through landscapes that are now intensely dry. Could the Richat structure have held cultural significance for some of those communities? Perhaps. But distinguishing intentional human activity from natural features is difficult across such an enormous area. The structure also preserves a record of environmental change. The Sahara was not always the vast desert seen today. During wetter phases of the African humid period, grasslands, lakes, rivers, and wildlife transformed large portions of the region. The landscape surrounding the Richat structure therefore belongs to a much longer environmental story, one in which climate, erosion, and human movement have repeatedly reshaped the region. Today, the Eye of the Sahara remains one of Earth's most striking geological formations. Its origins can be explained through powerful natural processes, yet its enormous scale and almost deliberate geometry continue to invite speculation. Perhaps the deeper mystery is not whether someone built the Eye of the Sahara, but how nature itself produced a formation that looks so remarkably ordered. And as researchers continue examining its rocks, surrounding archaeology, and ancient environmental history, the question remains: what other chapters of this immense landscape might still be hidden within its concentric stone rings? Leaving the immense stone rings of the Sahara, our journey now turns toward western Spain, where another remarkable monument has spent much of its existence hidden beneath water. In the province of Cáceres, near the Tagus River, a collection of enormous granite stones rises from the bed of the Valdecañas Reservoir. Known as the Dolmen de Guadalperal, the monument is often described as a prehistoric temple or megalithic tomb, and its long submergence has given it an unusual place in modern archaeology. When water levels fall, the stones emerge slowly from the reservoir. Upright slabs appear first, followed by rows of weathered blocks forming a passage and chamber. Their surfaces are worn by thousands of years, their edges softened by time and water. For much of the year, however, the monument remains invisible, concealed beneath the reservoir. The structure was documented archaeologically in the early 20th century, when German archaeologist Hugo Obermeier investigated the site during the 1920s. At that time, the monument stood within a dry landscape. Its later disappearance was the result of the construction of the Valdecañas Dam, completed in the 1960s, which flooded the surrounding area. But the stones themselves belong to a far older world. The Guadalperal monument is generally dated to the Neolithic or Chalcolithic period, roughly several thousand years before the Roman occupation of the Iberian Peninsula. Its basic arrangement resembles other megalithic monuments found across Western Europe. Large, standing stones forming a passage leading toward a chamber. Such structures are commonly interpreted as funerary monuments, although their exact functions could have been more complex. Megalithic sites often served as places of burial, ceremony, remembrance, and communal gathering. The effort required to transport and position enormous stones suggests that these monuments held considerable importance for the communities that created them. Yet, Guadalperal contains details that continue to attract attention. Among the stones is a carved granite slab, sometimes called the Guadalperal stele. Its markings have been interpreted as depicting a human figure, possibly with facial features or bodily contours. Other interpretations have proposed that the carving may represent a weapon, a shield, or another symbolic object. What exactly did its creators intend to portray? The uncertainty is intensified by the monument's altered condition. Some stones have shifted, deteriorated, or become partially displaced over the centuries. Later flooding has also complicated archaeological interpretation, making it difficult to reconstruct the original arrangement with complete confidence. One particularly intriguing feature is the monument's orientation. Like many megalithic structures, Guadalperal appears to have been deliberately aligned. Some researchers have examined its relationship with sunrise and seasonal movements of the sun, raising the possibility that astronomical observations formed part of its design. Such interpretations must be approached carefully. An orientation toward the rising sun does not automatically prove that a monument functioned as an astronomical observatory. Alignment can have religious, symbolic, practical, or cultural explanations. Still, the repeated appearance of celestial orientations among prehistoric monuments raises a broader question. How closely did these communities observe the sky? More speculative interpretations have occasionally portrayed Guadalperal as evidence of an advanced prehistoric tradition whose purpose has been forgotten. Others have imagined connections between Iberian megaliths and distant monument-building cultures. There is currently no compelling evidence for such sweeping conclusions. The stronger archaeological picture places Guadalperal within the broader megalithic traditions of prehistoric Iberia. Its builders were communities capable of organizing substantial labor, shaping stone, and creating monuments that survived for millennia. And perhaps that is what makes the site so compelling. For thousands of years, these stones stood beneath an open sky. Then, within a single generation, a modern reservoir submerged them. Today, changing water levels periodically reveal a monument that had been hidden from view, allowing archaeologists and visitors to glimpse fragments of a prehistoric landscape. When the stones disappear beneath the water once again, what remains unseen? The answer may lie not only in the submerged ground around the monument, but in the spaces between the stones, where traces of ritual, burial, and daily life may still preserve clues to the people who gathered here thousands of years ago. From the waterlogged stones of Guadalperal, the trail now leads deeper into Anatolia, toward a settlement shaped not by a single monumental structure, but by centuries of rebuilding. Near the modern town of Tavşanlı in western Turkey, Tavşanlı Höyük rises gently from the surrounding plain, a mound formed from layer upon layer of human occupation, each generation leaving traces of walls, tools, fires, burials, and abandoned spaces. At first, it appears almost ordinary, a low, archaeological mound surrounded by cultivated land. Yet, beneath its surface lies a settlement whose history reaches back thousands of years, connecting communities in western Anatolia with wider cultural networks that stretched across the ancient Near East and Aegean world. Tavşanlı Höyük is particularly significant because of evidence dating to the Bronze Age. Excavations have revealed architectural remains and material culture associated with communities that occupied the site during periods of considerable political and economic change. Pottery, metal objects, stone tools, architectural fragments, and other discoveries provide glimpses of how people lived, traded, worked, and adapted to shifting circumstances. But tells such as Tavşanlı hold a special kind of mystery. They are not monuments created at one moment. They are accumulations of human decisions. A wall was built, repaired, abandoned, buried, and replaced. A room changed its purpose. A structure collapsed, only to become the foundation for another. Over centuries, the settlement gradually rose above the surrounding landscape. What happened inside those successive layers? Archaeologists can identify patterns, but reconstructing the intentions behind them is far more difficult. A large building may have been administrative, domestic, industrial, or ceremonial. A carefully arranged space might indicate ritual activity, or simply practical organization. Without written records describing the settlement in detail, interpretation depends heavily on physical evidence. One of the most intriguing aspects of Tavşanlı Höyük is its position within the broader landscape of Western Anatolia. During the Bronze Age, this region was not isolated. Communities exchanged goods, technologies, and ideas across considerable distances. Metal resources were especially important, and Western Anatolia formed part of a wider network connecting inland settlements with coastal regions and the Aegean. Objects found at the site can therefore tell a story larger than Tavşanlı itself. Some discoveries have been discussed in connection with Hittite period cultural influence and the complex political geography of Western Anatolia. Yet, identifying precise political affiliations remains challenging. Ancient texts mention several Anatolian regions and peoples, but connecting those names directly to archaeological settlements is often uncertain. Could Tavşanlı Höyük have belonged to a political entity whose name survives only indirectly? That possibility has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some have imagined the settlement as a major regional center, perhaps more influential than its modest appearance suggests. Others have emphasized its connections with distant Bronze Age cultures, proposing that the site may have played a role in long-distance exchange networks. There is nothing inherently implausible about regional importance. Bronze Age settlements could occupy strategic positions because of access to resources, agricultural land, transportation routes, or political territories. But the evidence must be separated from assumptions. Archaeology can reveal patterns of contact without necessarily revealing the identities or ambitions of the people involved. And this is where the mound becomes especially compelling. Every layer represents a moment when someone decided to build, modify, preserve, abandon, or rebuild. The settlement was not frozen in time. It evolved continuously, responding to economic pressures, environmental conditions, social changes, and perhaps conflicts that left traces too subtle to recognize today. The absence of a complete written narrative leaves enormous gaps. We can reconstruct buildings. We can classify pottery. We can trace trade connections and compare architectural traditions. But can we recover the beliefs, fears, loyalties, and decisions of the people who stood within these walls? Perhaps future excavation will reveal another structure, another object, or another layer capable of changing the interpretation once again. For now, Tavşanlı Höyük remains a quiet reminder that some of the most intriguing archaeological mysteries are not hidden inside spectacular monuments. They are preserved within ordinary earth, compressed into layers beneath our feet, waiting for someone to uncover what earlier generations left behind.
From the layered earth of Tavşanlı Höyük, our journey now moves to a place where the past is hidden in an entirely different way. Beneath the clear waters of Lake Iznik in northwestern Turkey, the remains of an ancient basilica rest just offshore, their walls and foundations visible through the shallow water when conditions are favorable. The submerged structure was identified through aerial photography in 2014, when archaeologists noticed unusual geometric shapes beneath the lake's surface near the modern shoreline. What appeared at first to be little more than shadows soon revealed the outline of a substantial building. The discovery was striking because Lake Iznik conceals an archaeological landscape beneath its surface. The basilica is generally dated to the 4th century AD, although its precise chronology and development remain subjects of investigation. Its architectural form suggests a Christian religious building, probably associated with the early Christian community of ancient Nicaea, known today as Iznik. The city itself occupies an extraordinary place in history. Ancient Nicaea became one of the major urban centers of the Roman and Byzantine worlds. In AD 325, Emperor Constantine convened the First Council of Nicaea here, bringing together bishops from across the Christian world. The council addressed major theological disputes and produced the statement of faith that became the foundation of what is now known as the Nicene Creed. Could the submerged basilica have been connected with that remarkable religious history? The possibility has naturally attracted attention, but archaeologists have been cautious. There is no definitive evidence that the building was directly associated with the Council of AD 325. The structure appears to have been constructed later, and its relationship to earlier Christian activity at Nicaea remains an important subject of study. What is clear is that the basilica was eventually abandoned or destroyed, and rising waters gradually concealed its remains. One of the most intriguing questions concerns why the structure was built so close to the lake. Was the shoreline significantly different when the basilica was in use? Did environmental changes gradually transform the surrounding landscape? Or might the building have occupied a deliberate waterfront position within the ancient city? Archaeological investigations have revealed walls, architectural fragments, and other remains beneath the water. Researchers have also identified evidence suggesting that the site underwent destruction, rebuilding, and later alteration. Such layers complicate the story because what appears today as a single submerged monument may actually represent several phases of occupation. And then there is the question of what lies beyond the visible walls. Underwater archaeology is inherently difficult. Sediment can conceal objects and structures, while fluctuating water levels, erosion, and modern environmental conditions can disturb fragile remains. Aerial photographs reveal the broad outline, but they cannot provide the complete archaeological picture. This has encouraged more speculative ideas. Some have suggested that the basilica could have been associated with a major religious complex extending farther into the lake or toward the ancient shoreline. Others have wondered whether undiscovered structures might still lie beneath sediment nearby. Such possibilities remain unconfirmed. The more dramatic theories often emerge from the extraordinary historical reputation of Nicaea itself. Because the city hosted one of Christianity's most important councils, it is tempting to connect every early Christian structure in the region with that event. Yet archaeology requires a more cautious approach. A monument can belong to a historically important landscape without being directly linked to its most famous moment. Still, standing at the edge of Lake Iznik, the relationship between water and history is difficult to ignore. For centuries, people walked through this region, worshipped within its buildings, and lived beside the shoreline. Then the landscape changed, and a structure that once stood in open air became part of an underwater world. Today, divers and archaeologists can approach walls that have been hidden for generations. Each stone raises another fragment of the story, while the lake preserves the silence between them. Perhaps future exploration will reveal inscriptions, burials, or architectural remains capable of clarifying the basilica's purpose in final years. Until then, the submerged church remains suspended between archaeology and uncertainty, a monument from a formative period of Christian history, resting beneath the water and waiting for the lake to give up whatever it has kept hidden. From the submerged basilica of Lake Iznik, our journey now moves from archaeology beneath real waters to an ancient material whose name has become inseparable from one of history's most enduring legends, Orichalcum. The story begins not with an excavation, but with a text. In Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written in the 4th century BC, the philosopher described Atlantis as a powerful island society that existed in a distant age. Among the materials associated with the city was a distinctive substance called orichalcum. Plato portrayed it as highly valuable, second only to gold, and described it as being used for architectural decoration within the legendary city. For centuries, the identity of this mysterious metal remained uncertain. Was orichalcum a genuine material known to ancient Mediterranean cultures, or was it simply part of Plato's literary construction? Modern archaeology has provided an intriguing piece of the puzzle. In 2015, divers exploring a shipwreck discovered near the coast of Gela in Sicily recovered numerous metallic ingots from the seabed. Their unusual appearance attracted immediate attention. Analysis later showed that the material was primarily a copper-zinc alloy, essentially a form of brass. The discovery was significant because ancient texts had already associated orichalcum with a valuable copper-based material. Could these ingots represent the substance Plato had described? The answer is more complicated than the legend suggests. Researchers have identified the recovered material as a brass-like alloy produced through ancient metallurgical techniques. The ingots are generally dated to around the 6th century BC, placing them centuries after the supposed age of Atlantis described by Plato. Their composition is consistent with ancient Mediterranean metallurgy and does not require an unknown civilization or mysterious technology. Yet the connection with the ancient name remains fascinating. Plato never provided a modern chemical description of orichalcum. His account presents it as a distinctive and precious substance, but the precise meaning of the term is uncertain. The word itself appears in other ancient contexts, and scholars have proposed different interpretations over time. Some have connected it with brass. Others have suggested copper alloys, bronze, or even naturally occurring minerals. The Sicilian ingots therefore offers something remarkable, not proof of Atlantis, but evidence that ancient Mediterranean metalworkers produced valuable copper-zinc alloys that could resemble the material described in Plato's writings. The discovery also reveals something about the sophistication of ancient trade. The Gela shipwreck appears to have carried a substantial cargo of metal ingots, suggesting that processed materials moved between communities by sea. Their presence demonstrates a level of specialization in mining, metallurgy, transportation, and commerce that is sometimes underestimated when viewed through the lens of later technology. But the mystery deepens when we return to Plato. Why did he choose the name Orichalcum? Was he describing a real metal known to his audience, drawing upon earlier traditions, or creating a material that would help give Atlantis an atmosphere of extraordinary wealth? Classical writers often preserved older terms whose meanings had already become uncertain by their own time. This ambiguity has opened the door to more speculative theories. Some writers have proposed that the Gela ingots are surviving examples of the very material Plato described. Others have gone further, suggesting that their existence somehow confirms the historical reality of Atlantis. There is no archaeological evidence establishing such a connection. The dates, geographic context, and broader archaeological record fit comfortably within known Mediterranean cultures. The ingots do not carry inscriptions identifying them as Atlantean, nor do they point toward a vanished super-civilization. And yet the coincidence remains captivating. A word recorded by Plato, a mysterious metal associated with a legendary island. Centuries later, a shipwreck off Sicily carrying unusual copper-zinc ingots from the ancient Mediterranean world. Perhaps the connection is simply linguistic and technological, a glimpse into an ancient material that later became wrapped in legend. Or perhaps the surviving evidence represents only a small fragment of a much larger story about how ancient peoples understood metals, trade, and distant lands. The ingots now offer no final answer. They rest as tangible evidence of ancient craftsmanship, while the legendary identity of Orichalcum remains suspended between literature, archaeology, and interpretation. And somewhere between Plato's description and the corroded metal recovered from the seabed, one question still lingers. How much of the original story has survived, and how much was transformed by time into legend? From the uncertain identity of ancient Orichalcum, we now turn to a figure whose existence is beyond dispute, yet whose final years remain surrounded by questions. Far from the Mediterranean, in the heart of China, an enormous funerary landscape lies near modern Xi'an. Beneath its earth rests the tomb complex of Qin Shi Huang, the ruler who transformed a divided realm into the first unified Chinese empire. Qin Shi Huang was born in 259 BC as Yingzheng, heir to the state of Qin. He became king while still a child, and after years of political struggle conquered the rival states one by one. In 221 BC, he adopted the title Qin Shi Huang, commonly translated as First Emperor of Qin, declaring the beginning of a new imperial order. His achievement was extraordinary. He standardized systems of writing, weights, measurements, and currency. Roads and defensive structures were expanded while enormous construction projects reshaped the landscape. Yet the same ruler who pursued political unity also developed an intense concern with his own mortality. That concern may be the key to understanding the mysteries surrounding his later life. According to ancient historical accounts, Qin Shi Huang became increasingly interested in achieving immortality. Court specialists, physicians, and alchemists were summoned to search for substances capable of extending human life. Expeditions were reportedly sent toward distant islands in search of legendary immortals. What did the emperor hope to find? Perhaps the answer seemed simple to him. If death could be delayed through the correct substance, then the power he had created might continue indefinitely. But the search may have had a darker consequence. Traditional historical sources, particularly the writings of Sima Qian, described Qin Shi Huang taking mercury-containing preparations intended to promote longevity. Modern toxicology makes such accounts deeply significant. Mercury is highly poisonous, and repeated exposure can damage the nervous system and internal organs. The emperor died in 210 BC during a journey through the eastern regions of his empire. The exact medical cause remains uncertain. Was his death connected to mercury poisoning? Did illness, infection, cardiovascular disease, or another condition contribute? The historical record does not provide enough evidence for a definitive diagnosis. Yet the possibility that a ruler seeking eternal life may have accelerated his own death remains one of antiquity's most haunting ironies. Then there is the tomb itself. The mausoleum complex is guarded by the famous terracotta army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers, horses, weapons, and chariots arranged to accompany the emperor into the afterlife. But the central burial chamber has not yet been excavated. According to Sima Qian, the underground tomb contained elaborate representations of the empire, including rivers and seas made with flowing mercury. Modern surveys have detected unusually elevated mercury concentrations in the soil around the burial mound, although interpretations of this evidence remain cautious. If the ancient account is even partly accurate, what might still exist inside? The central chamber has remained sealed for more than 2,000 years. Concerns about preservation, structural stability, and the potential damage caused by excavation have contributed to the decision not to open it. This leaves one of China's most important archaeological sites suspended between evidence and expectation. Some speculative theories imagine hidden mechanisms, elaborate traps, or vast treasures preserved beneath the mound. Ancient sources do mention defensive devices, but the more dramatic versions are difficult to verify. Archaeology has confirmed the extraordinary scale of the funerary complex, yet much of the emperor's central tomb remains inaccessible. Perhaps the greatest mystery is therefore not whether Qin Shi Huang existed, but how much of his private world still survives beneath the earth. The emperor who attempted to control an entire realm could not control the one force that ultimately defeated him. His body disappeared into a sealed chamber, while his legacy became one of the most remarkable archaeological stories ever uncovered. And somewhere beneath the quiet mound near Xi'an, behind layers of earth that have remained untouched since 210 BC, the final chapter of Qin Shi Huang's story may still be waiting to be read. From the sealed tomb of Qin Shi Huang, our journey now returns to the Mediterranean, to a place where the mystery is not concentrated within a single burial chamber but scattered across an abandoned city of stone. High in the rugged mountains of southwestern Turkey, the ruins of ancient Sidyma lie among pine-covered slopes and rocky valleys, far removed from the major tourist centers of the coast. At first, the remains seem almost tranquil. Weathered sarcophagi stand beside paths and olive trees, columns emerge from vegetation. Tombs are carved into hillsides, while fragments of walls and inscriptions reveal the presence of a community that once occupied this remote corner of Lycia. Sidyma was a Lycian settlement whose history stretches back to antiquity. It later became part of the Roman world, and its surviving remains reflect several centuries of cultural change. Unlike the monumental capitals of the ancient Mediterranean, Sidyma was never an enormous imperial metropolis. Its importance lies partly in the extraordinary concentration of funerary monuments and the clues they preserve about ordinary communities living far from the centers of power. The landscape itself is the first mystery. Why establish a settlement here surrounded by steep mountains and difficult terrain? The answer may be found in Lycia's geography. The region is naturally divided by rugged valleys and mountain ranges, creating isolated communities connected by narrow routes. Such terrain encouraged distinctive local traditions, while also giving Lycian settlements a degree of separation from larger political centers. Sidyma's tombs are particularly revealing. Across Lycia, burial architecture became one of the most recognizable expressions of local identity. Tombs could resemble houses, temples, or monumental chambers carved into rock. Sarcophagi were decorated with distinctive lids and architectural elements, transforming the places of burial into visible statements of status and memory. At Sidyma, these monuments remain scattered throughout the landscape. Some are remarkably well preserved, Others have collapsed or become partly absorbed by vegetation. Their inscriptions occasionally identify individuals, families, officials, or civic benefactors, offering rare glimpses into the people who once lived here. And yet, inscriptions also raise questions. A name carved into stone can tell us who someone was, but rarely explains how they lived. We may know a person's social position without knowing their ambitions, relationships, beliefs, or fears. Archaeology preserves objects far more easily than personal experience. The city also reveals a complex mixture of cultural influences. The Lycian language and traditions gradually encountered Greek culture and later Roman political authority. By the Roman period, inscriptions and architecture show a community participating in wider Mediterranean customs while maintaining local characteristics. This cultural layering makes Sidyma especially interesting. Was its identity gradually transformed, or did older traditions continue beneath the surface of Roman life? The archaeological remains suggest neither complete isolation nor complete assimilation. Instead, Sidyma appears to have occupied an intermediate position, where local traditions survived while new political and cultural influences were incorporated. Its later history becomes less certain. As Roman authority changed and urban networks shifted, many smaller settlements across Lycia declined. Sidyma eventually lost much of its former importance. Buildings deteriorated, roads fell into disuse, and vegetation gradually reclaimed the settlement. But abandonment does not necessarily mean disappearance. The remains continued to exist within the landscape, sometimes reused by later inhabitants. Stones could be incorporated into walls, tombs could become landmarks, and ancient structures could acquire new meanings long after their original purposes had been forgotten. This has encouraged speculation about hidden chambers and undiscovered sections of the city. Given the rugged terrain and incomplete archaeological exploration of many Lycian sites, it is entirely possible that parts of Sidyma remain unexamined. But claims of secret tunnels, concealed treasures, or mysterious underground complexes require evidence that has not yet been established. The more compelling mystery may be simpler. How much can a ruined settlement tell us about the people who built it? Sidyma offers fragments, inscriptions, tombs, architectural remains, roads, foundations, and objects left behind. Together, they create a partial portrait of a community that existed for generations. Yet the voices behind those fragments have largely disappeared. One of the most striking features is the relationship between the living city and the dead. Tombs were not hidden away in some distant cemetery. They were integrated into the surrounding landscape, sometimes positioned where travelers and residents could encounter them repeatedly. Was this intended as a reminder of ancestry? A declaration of social standing? A way of keeping the dead present within the community? Perhaps it was all of these things. In the ancient Mediterranean, memory was often expressed through stone. A tomb could outlive a family, a city, even a political order. And Sidyma demonstrates how effectively such monuments could preserve traces of lives that would otherwise have vanished completely. Yet the city still holds unanswered questions. Some structures remain poorly understood, while the full sequence of occupation and decline is not perfectly reconstructed. The surrounding landscape may contain additional evidence waiting beneath soil and vegetation. For now, Sidyma remains suspended between visibility and obscurity, a city whose stones are remarkably tangible, yet whose human story remains incomplete. Among the silent sarcophagi and weathered inscriptions, one can sense how little survives from an entire community. And perhaps the most enduring mystery is not what happened to the stones, but what happened to the people who once walked among them, and how many traces of their world still lie hidden somewhere within the mountains.
From the mountain tombs of Sidyma, our journey now moves far east, toward the ancient landscapes of Central Asia, where the remains of a once powerful fortress rise from the plains of Khwarezm. Here, in modern Uzbekistan, Toprak Kala appears as a vast rectangular settlement of sun-dried earth, its walls softened by centuries of wind and exposure. What was once a royal center now stands largely silent beneath the open sky. Toprak Kala, whose name means Earth Fortress, is generally dated to the Kushan-Sasanian period, with major construction beginning around the 2nd or 3rd century AD. It formed part of the ancient Khwarezmian cultural sphere, a region shaped by agriculture, long-distance trade, fortified settlements, and powerful local rulers. The scale of the site is immediately striking. Its fortified enclosure once contained monumental buildings, residential areas, temples, administrative spaces, and a large palace complex. Towers and defensive walls surrounded the settlement, while broad streets divided its interior into organized sections. But Toprak Kala was more than a fortress. Archaeological excavations revealed evidence of a sophisticated administrative and ceremonial center. Among the most important discoveries were fragments of painted wall decoration, sculptures, coins, inscriptions, and documents written on leather and wooden tablets. Together, these finds provide an unusually detailed glimpse into the political and cultural world of ancient Khwarezm. And yet, the more archaeologists uncover, the more questions emerge. Who exactly lived within the palace? What rituals took place inside its decorated chambers? And why was such an ambitious center eventually abandoned? The palace complex is particularly intriguing. Its monumental rooms were decorated with colorful paintings and sculptural figures, including representations of rulers, warriors, musicians, and divine or mythical beings. Some surviving fragments reveal an artistic tradition influenced by several cultural currents moving through Central Asia. Toprak Kala therefore reflects a world far more connected than its remote location might suggest. Khwarezm stood near important routes linking Central Asia with Iran, the steppe regions, and territories farther east. Goods, artistic styles, technologies, and political ideas could travel considerable distances. The architecture and decoration at Toprak Kala appear to preserve traces of these interactions. Yet, identifying the exact meaning of the palace imagery remains difficult. A painted figure might represent a deity, ancestor, ruler, or symbolic character. A throne room might have served political ceremonies, religious rituals, or both. Without a complete written explanation, modern researchers must reconstruct meaning from fragments. One particularly fascinating discovery involved administrative documents preserved within the complex. These records suggest that the palace was not simply a ceremonial residence. It was part of a functioning bureaucracy capable of organizing resources and managing a substantial population. This raises an important possibility. Could Toprak Kala have served as the administrative heart of a centralized Khwarezmian kingdom? The archaeological evidence strongly supports the presence of organized authority, although the precise political structure remains debated. The site may have functioned as a royal residence, administrative headquarters, ceremonial center, or a combination of all three. More speculative interpretations sometimes portray Toprak Kala as evidence of a mysterious civilization, possessing knowledge or technologies far beyond what conventional archaeology recognizes. Such claims occasionally focus on the sophisticated planning of the complex or the unusual artistic motifs found inside the palace. But there is no need to invoke unknown technology to explain its achievements. The construction of Toprak Kala required organization, skilled labor, engineering knowledge, and access to agricultural resources. Ancient societies across Central Asia were fully capable of creating monumental architecture using established techniques adapted to local conditions. The greater mystery lies in how such a large center functioned within its environment. The surrounding region is now intensely arid, but ancient Khwarezm depended upon irrigation. Canals transformed desert landscapes into productive agricultural zones, supporting cities and fortified settlements. Without the water management systems that sustained them, places like Toprak Kala could not have flourished. And that makes the site's eventual decline especially significant. At some point, Toprak Kala ceased to function as a major center. Its buildings were abandoned, its walls deteriorated, and wind gradually began to reshape the remains. The precise circumstances remain uncertain. Political changes, shifting power centers, environmental pressures, or changes in irrigation could all have contributed. Perhaps the decline was not caused by a single event at all. Like many ancient settlements, Toprak Kala may have faded through a gradual combination of political and environmental changes. Today, the palace rooms are open to the sky. Painted figures that once watched over ceremonies survive only in fragments, while documents that once recorded everyday administration have become archaeological evidence. The fortress seems imposing even in ruin, but the silence around it is deceptive. Beneath the eroded walls lies evidence of government, religion, art, trade, and ordinary human activity. And somewhere within the remaining structures, additional fragments may still survive, pieces capable of clarifying who controlled Toprak Kala, why its palace was built on such a grand scale, and what ultimately caused this extraordinary center to fall quiet. For now, the Earth Fortress remains an incomplete record of Khorazm's past, its walls preserving a story that archaeology has begun to reconstruct, but has not yet fully recovered. From the windswept ruins of Toprak Kala, our journey now returns to the Nile Valley, where two enormous stone figures have stood for nearly 3.5 millennia. On the western bank of the Nile at Luxor, the Colossi of Memnon rise above the surrounding plain, their weathered forms catching the first light of morning. The statues were originally erected during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, who ruled Egypt during the 14th century BC. Each colossal figure was carved from a single massive block of quartzite, and once stood before the entrance to a vast mortuary temple dedicated to the king. Much of that temple has disappeared. The statues, however, survived. They have endured earthquakes, flooding, erosion, reuse of ancient stone, and centuries of changing landscapes. Yet, their most intriguing chapter began long after their construction, when the northern Colossus acquired a reputation for producing an unusual sound at dawn. Ancient Greek and Roman travelers described hearing a mysterious voice or musical tone emerging from the statue around sunrise. The phenomenon became so famous that the northern statue came to be associated with Memnon, a legendary warrior from Greek mythology. According to classical tradition, Memnon was the son of Eos, goddess of the dawn. Each morning, it was said, the statue responded to the rising sun with a sound resembling a greeting to his mother. But what was actually happening? The earliest surviving descriptions come from travelers who visited Egypt during the Roman period, centuries after Amenhotep III's reign. Several writers reported hearing a sound from the northern Colossus, while others described it as a crack, a voice, or a musical note. The reports are fascinating, but they must be treated carefully. The statue was not originally designed as a musical instrument, and there is no evidence that its ancient Egyptian builders intended it to produce a sound. Instead, the phenomenon appears to have resulted from a combination of environmental conditions and damage to the monument. In antiquity, the northern Colossus had suffered significant structural damage, probably during an earthquake in the early Roman period. The upper portion of the statue was damaged, leaving cracks and cavities within the stone. When the temperature changed rapidly around dawn, moisture trapped within the porous stone could evaporate as the surface warmed. Air moving through narrow cracks and cavities may have produced vibrations that sounded like a faint tone. This explanation is consistent with known physical processes. It also explains why the sound was associated with sunrise rather than occurring continuously. But there is another intriguing detail. The phenomenon appears to have disappeared after the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus ordered repairs to the damaged statue around AD 196. Once the cracks were filled and the monument stabilized, the famous sound was no longer reported. If the repairs silence the Colossus, the mystery becomes less supernatural and more archaeological. Yet that does not make it less fascinating. Imagine approaching the statue at dawn nearly 2,000 years ago. The surrounding temple had already fallen into ruin, but the colossal figure remained standing. As the first sunlight touched the stone, a faint sound seemed to emerge from its damaged body. For travelers who knew nothing about the mechanics of resonance, moisture, and thermal expansion, the experience could easily appear extraordinary. Some later interpretations have suggested that ancient Egyptian priests may have understood the acoustic properties of the monument and deliberately incorporated them into ritual practices. Others have proposed that the sound was engineered intentionally. There is no convincing archaeological evidence for such claims. The stronger explanation remains natural, a damaged stone monument responding to changing temperature and moisture conditions. Still, the ancient accounts raise another question. Why did the phenomenon become so closely associated with divine communication? Part of the answer lies in the cultural world of Roman Egypt. Ancient visitors often interpreted Egyptian monuments through Greek mythology. The statue of Amenhotep III became Memnon in their imagination, and the unexplained sound acquired a narrative that connected it with the dawn goddess. The physical event may have been natural, but the meaning people assigned to it was cultural. That distinction is important. Archaeology can investigate the cracks, stone composition, temperature changes, and historical repairs. It can examine ancient accounts and compare them with the monument's condition. But it cannot fully reconstruct what every listener felt when that sound appeared after centuries of silence. Today, the Colossi stand quietly beside the Nile. Their damaged surfaces no longer produce the famous voice, and the temple complex that once surrounded them survives only in fragments. Yet the story remains embedded within the stones. A monument built to glorify a pharaoh eventually became famous for something its creators may never have intended, a mysterious sound heard by foreign travelers at the moment when night gave way to morning. Perhaps the strangest part is that the phenomenon required no hidden technology, no forgotten civilization, and no supernatural force. It may have emerged simply from stone, moisture, temperature, damage, and the human instinct to give meaning to sounds we cannot immediately explain. And as the sun rises over the silent Colossi today, the ancient voice is gone. But the question remains, how many other natural phenomena once woven into the experience of ancient monuments have disappeared before anyone could understand them? From the silent Colossi of Memnon, our journey now crosses an ocean and enters a very different kind of archaeological mystery, one preserved not in monumental stone, but in lines, symbols, painted landscapes, and fragments of a world that was rapidly transformed after the arrival of Europeans. In the archives of Mexico and Europe, several early colonial maps preserve glimpses of the Aztec world. Yet among them is one particularly intriguing document, the Mapa de Uppsala, also known as the Uppsala Map or Santa Cruz Map. Created in the 16th century, it presents an extraordinary panorama of central Mexico, including the great city of Tenochtitlan, surrounding settlements, mountains, lakes, roads, rivers, and communities. It is not a map of the Aztec Empire in the modern sense, and that distinction is important. The Aztec Empire was not represented through fixed national borders like those found on modern political maps. It was a network of tributary relationships, military alliances, conquered territories, and subordinate communities centered on the triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. By the early 16th century, this political system controlled an enormous portion of central Mexico. Then, everything changed. In 1519, Hernán Cortés and his expedition arrived on the Gulf Coast. Within only a few years, the political order centered on Tenochtitlan had collapsed. The Spanish conquest brought warfare, disease, forced resettlement, religious transformation, and the destruction or alteration of many indigenous institutions. Yet, maps survived. Some were created by indigenous artists working within colonial administrations. Others were produced by European or mixed teams attempting to understand unfamiliar territories. Their purposes varied. Some recorded land ownership. Others documented tribute, towns, routes, agriculture, or jurisdiction. The result is a remarkable collection of visual records, but also a puzzle. How accurately could these maps preserve a political landscape that was itself changing? The Mappa de Uppsala is especially fascinating because it combines indigenous geographic conventions with European cartographic influences. It portrays Tenochtitlan surrounded by the waters of Lake Texcoco, with causeways and settlements radiating outward. Mountains rise around the basin, while roads and communities are represented across the surrounding landscape. At first glance, it resembles a bird's-eye view. But it is not simply a scaled geographical survey. Different elements appear to have been emphasized according to their cultural or administrative importance. Symbols, place signs, pictorial representations, and written annotations coexist within the same document. This creates a problem for modern interpretation. Should every symbol be read literally? Probably not. Indigenous Mesoamerican mapping traditions often communicated information through combinations of imagery, place signs, landscape features, and social or political meaning. A settlement could be represented through a glyph. A mountain could carry a name. A road could indicate movement between communities rather than simply marking a physical line on the ground. The map was therefore not merely describing space, it was communicating relationships. And this is where the idea of a lost map of the Aztec Empire becomes especially intriguing. There was no single surviving master map that gives us a complete picture of the empire at the moment before the Spanish conquest. Instead, researchers reconstruct Aztec geography through numerous sources: colonial maps, indigenous manuscripts, tribute records, archaeological evidence, place names, Spanish accounts, and later copies of earlier documents. Each source preserves only part of the picture. Some documents were destroyed during the conquest or in later campaigns against indigenous religious traditions. Others were lost through ordinary decay, dispersal, or neglect. In some cases, what survives is not the original document but a later copy, whose relationship to earlier material is difficult to establish. The missing pieces are therefore as interesting as the surviving ones. What might an undiscovered pre-conquest map have shown? Would it have displayed the empire's tributary territories, military routes, agricultural zones, sacred landscapes, political boundaries? Or would it have represented the world according to an entirely different concept of geography? Some speculative writers have imagined that the Aztecs possessed extraordinarily precise maps covering enormous distances, perhaps recording regions far beyond the empire's actual political reach. There is no strong evidence for such a hidden cartographic archive, yet the indigenous geographic knowledge demonstrated by surviving sources should not be underestimated. Communities across Mesoamerica understood complex terrain, waterways, agricultural systems, and regional connections. Merchants, soldiers, messengers, and officials moved through extensive networks long before European arrival. The challenge is understanding how that knowledge was recorded. The Aztec world was deeply visual. Manuscripts could preserve histories, tribute obligations, genealogies, calendars, place names, and ritual information through imagery rather than alphabetic writing alone. Maps belong to this broader intellectual tradition. But after the conquest, the meaning of maps changed. Spanish authorities needed to know who controlled land, where communities were located, what resources existed, and which territories belonged to which indigenous groups. Maps could therefore become instruments of administration. An indigenous map created for local purposes could be copied, modified, translated, or reinterpreted for colonial use. The same landscape could acquire a different meaning depending on who was reading it. This is particularly visible in colonial documents that combine indigenous pictorial traditions with Spanish annotations. A place may carry an ancient indigenous name while being described according to new administrative categories. The result is neither entirely pre-Hispanic nor entirely European. It is a record of transition, and perhaps that is why these maps can feel almost ghost-like. They preserve a landscape that still exists physically, but whose political and cultural structure was dramatically transformed. The lakes remain, the mountains remain, and many towns still bear names derived from indigenous languages. Yet the world represented on the page belonged to a very different political order. Tenochtitlan itself provides the clearest example. When the Spanish first encountered the island city, it was one of the largest urban centers in the Americas. Causeways connected it to the mainland, canals carried people through the city, and enormous ceremonial structures dominated its central precinct. Today, much of that landscape lies beneath modern Mexico City. The ancient lake system was progressively drained and transformed. Colonial buildings were constructed over indigenous structures. Streets changed. Canals disappeared. The physical geography that once defined the Aztec capital became increasingly difficult to recognize. Maps, therefore, become more than illustrations. They are archaeological evidence for landscapes that have been dramatically altered. A document, such as the Mapa de Uppsala, can preserve details that excavation alone cannot easily recover. The relationship between settlements, the arrangement of roads, the location of waterways, and the visual organization of the surrounding basin. But it also leaves unanswered questions. Some place identifications remain debated. Some symbols are difficult to interpret. The intentions of the mapmakers are not always clear. Even the date and circumstances of production require careful scholarly analysis. More adventurous theories sometimes treat these ambiguities as evidence of a deliberately concealed geography. According to such interpretations, certain indigenous maps may have encoded knowledge of distant lands or routes that European observers failed to recognize. There is little evidence to support the more dramatic versions of these claims. Still, the basic mystery remains legitimate. How much geographic knowledge existed in Mesoamerica before European contact, and how much of it disappeared before it could be recorded? The Spanish conquest did not simply replace one political system with another. It interrupted institutions, languages, religious traditions, and methods of preserving knowledge. Some indigenous scholars and artists continued recording their world, sometimes working within colonial systems, but countless earlier records were lost. Every surviving map is therefore a fragment, and perhaps the most haunting possibility is that somewhere, in an archive, private collection, forgotten library, or archaeological deposit, another fragment may still exist. Not necessarily a legendary master map. Perhaps only a small document showing a road, a settlement, a boundary, or a landscape that has not yet been correctly identified. Such a discovery could change our understanding of how the Aztec world was organized, not because it would reveal a mythical secret, but because even a modest piece of evidence can alter the reconstruction of a vanished political landscape. The maps that survive tell us that indigenous cartographic knowledge was sophisticated, adaptable, and deeply connected to culture and power. From the fading outlines of the Aztec world, our journey now moves to the Mediterranean, where another civilization left behind thousands of enigmatic stone structures across a single island. On Sardinia, massive towers rise from hillsides, valleys, and open fields, built from enormous blocks of stone and preserved for thousands of years. These are the Nuraghe, the defining monuments of prehistoric Sardinia. At first glance, a nuraghe can resemble a fortress. Its thick circular walls, narrow entrances, elevated chambers, and commanding position certainly suggest defense. Some rise more than 20 meters above the surrounding terrain, while others form sprawling complexes of towers connected by walls and courtyards. But what were they really built for? The answer is not as straightforward as the appearance suggests. Nuraghe were constructed primarily during the Bronze Age, beginning around the 2nd millennium BC, and their development continued for centuries. More than 7,000 are believed to survive across Sardinia, although estimates vary depending on how ruins and smaller structures are counted. Their sheer number is remarkable. Why would prehistoric communities devote so much labor to constructing monumental stone towers across an island? The conventional interpretation has changed over time. Early researchers often viewed Nuraghe primarily as defensive structures, perhaps the strongholds of tribal chiefs or local rulers. Later, archaeological work revealed a more complicated picture. Some Nuraghe were isolated towers. Others developed into large architectural complexes containing multiple towers, courtyards, walls, stairways, chambers, and associated settlements. This diversity suggests that they did not all serve exactly the same purpose. Some may have had defensive roles. Others could have functioned as residences, political centers, storage facilities, ritual spaces, or places where communities gathered. The mystery becomes even deeper at sites such as Sunaraxi at Barumini, one of the best-known Nuragic complexes. Its central tower is surrounded by additional towers and defensive walls, creating an elaborate structure that reflects considerable planning and engineering skill. The builders worked with massive stone blocks without modern machinery. They had to select suitable materials, transport them, shape them, and arrange them into stable structures. The result was architecture capable of surviving earthquakes, weathering, abandonment, and thousands of years of changing landscapes. Inside some towers are corbelled chambers, rooms created by gradually projecting stones inward until the opening at the top could be closed. The technique is ancient, but the scale and precision of some Nuraghe remain impressive. What happened inside these rooms? That is harder to determine. Archaeologists have discovered pottery, tools, animal remains, metal objects, and other materials associated with everyday activity. Some sites also contain evidence interpreted as ritual or communal use. One particularly intriguing category is the so-called sacred wells and water sanctuaries associated with Nuragic culture. Structures such as the well temple at Santa Cristina feature carefully constructed stairways descending toward underground water. The precision of these monuments has encouraged theories about astronomical alignment, sacred water rituals, and sophisticated knowledge of the seasonal cycle. Some researchers have explored possible relationships between the orientation of certain structures and celestial events. More speculative interpretations go further, proposing that Nuragic builders possessed advanced astronomical systems or encoded hidden mathematical principles into their architecture. The evidence does not establish such extraordinary claims. Yet, the relationship between Nuragic architecture, landscape, water, and celestial observation remains an important area of study. The Nuragic civilization was also connected to the wider Mediterranean. Archaeological discoveries have revealed objects and materials associated with distant regions, showing that Sardinia was not isolated. Metalworking, maritime trade, and contact with other Mediterranean communities brought foreign influences to the island. Among the most intriguing discoveries are the famous bronze figurines known as the Nuragic bronzetti. These small sculptures depict warriors, chiefs, boats, animals, and other figures providing glimpses into the visual world of Nuragic society. Some figures appear highly stylized. Others display weapons, clothing, helmets, or elaborate features that raise questions about social identity and ritual meaning. Could these bronzes represent ordinary people, warriors, ancestors, or supernatural beings? Their exact symbolism remains debated. There are also much more speculative interpretations. Some writers have proposed that Sardinia was home to an advanced maritime civilization that played a much larger role in Mediterranean history than conventional narratives acknowledge. Others have connected Nuraghic monuments with distant cultures, or even with legends of lost civilizations. There is no reliable archaeological evidence establishing these larger claims. What the evidence does show is already remarkable. A complex island society capable of monumental construction, long-distance exchange, metalworking, organized communities, and distinctive religious traditions. And then, gradually, the Nuraghic world changed. During the first millennium BC, Sardinia came increasingly into contact with Phoenician and later Carthaginian influence. Some Nuraghic settlements were transformed, while others declined or were incorporated into new political systems. Later, Roman expansion brought another profound transformation. The Nuraghe survived. Their builders did not. Today, thousands of these structures remain scattered across Sardinia, sometimes standing alone beneath the sky, sometimes surrounded by the remains of settlements that are barely visible. Each tower preserves only part of the story. Was a particular Nuraghe a fortress, a residence, a ceremonial center, or something that served several purposes at different moments? Did communities gather within these stone walls for political decisions, religious ceremonies, or seasonal events? Perhaps the answer changed over time. A structure built for defense could later become a gathering place. A political center could acquire sacred significance. A sacred monument could eventually become a ruin whose original meaning was forgotten. That possibility may explain why the Nuraghic landscape remains so difficult to categorize. The towers are unmistakable, yet their precise functions remain elusive, and with thousands of monuments still standing, the island may contain evidence capable of changing our understanding of Nuraghic society. Excavations, environmental studies, and new analyses of artifacts continue to reveal fragments of a culture that left no surviving historical narrative of its own. The stones remain. They rise from Sardinia's hills as silent witnesses to a society that flourished long before written accounts described the island in detail. And perhaps somewhere within an unexcavated settlement, a sealed chamber, or an overlooked fragment of evidence lies the clue that could finally explain why the Nuraghic people built so many towers, and what they truly believed those immense stones were meant to protect. From the monumental stone towers of Sardinia, the journey now moves deep into the Sahara, toward a landscape that appears almost empty today. In southeastern Algeria, within the Tassili Niger region, the dry channels and rocky walls of Oued Djerat preserve thousands of ancient engravings and paintings. On weathered sandstone surfaces, hunters, animals, human figures, and enigmatic scenes remain suspended across a landscape transformed by climate and time. Today, Oued Djerat is part of an intensely arid environment. Water is scarce, vegetation is limited, and the surrounding terrain can appear almost inhospitable. Yet, the images carved into its rocks tell a very different story. They reveal a Sahara that was once alive with water. During earlier periods of the Holocene, North Africa experienced substantially wetter conditions. Rivers and seasonal lakes crossed regions that are now desert, while grassland supported large populations of wildlife. Communities moved through these environments, hunting animals, gathering resources, and eventually developing increasingly complex forms of pastoralism. Oued Djerat preserves traces of that transformation. Among the most recognizable engravings are images of large animals that would seem completely out of place in the modern Sahara. Giraffes, elephants, rhinoceroses, cattle, antelope, and other creatures appear on the rock surfaces, sometimes rendered with remarkable detail. Why were these animals so important to the people who portrayed them? The simplest explanation is that they reflected the world surrounding the artists. A community living among abundant wildlife would have had countless reasons to depict animals, perhaps as records of hunting, expressions of identity, elements of ritual, or representations of beliefs about the natural world. But the sheer variety of imagery raises deeper questions. Some figures are realistic enough to allow confident identification. Others are stylized, abstract, or difficult to interpret. Human figures appear alongside animals, sometimes carrying weapons or participating in scenes whose meaning has been lost. The rock surfaces therefore become something like a prehistoric archive. There are no written texts explaining the images. No surviving storyteller can tell us which animals were sacred, which scenes represented actual events, and which belonged entirely to the imagination. Archaeologists have developed chronological frameworks for Saharan rock art based on style, subject matter, superimposition, archaeological context, and comparisons with other sites. The imagery is generally understood as representing several periods of human activity rather than a single moment. This is important because Oued Djerat was not created by one generation. Different groups returned to the same rocks over long spans of time. Later, artists sometimes carved over earlier images, creating layers of visual history. A single rock surface can therefore preserve multiple periods, with one artistic tradition partially obscuring another. What happened between those periods? Climate may provide part of the answer. As the African humid period gradually ended, rainfall decreased across much of North Africa. Lakes and rivers contracted. Grasslands diminished. Wildlife populations changed, and communities increasingly adapted to drier conditions. The transformation was not instantaneous. It unfolded over centuries, perhaps forcing repeated changes in settlement, mobility, subsistence, and social organization. The imagery appears to preserve hints of these changing relationships with the environment. Early scenes emphasize wild animals, while later artistic traditions increasingly feature domesticated cattle and pastoral life. That transition is one of the most important clues in understanding the people who used Oued Djerat. Yet, some of the imagery remains difficult to explain. Certain human figures have unusual body shapes or elaborate features. Some scenes appear almost ceremonial. Others have been interpreted as possible representations of masks, costumes, or ritual specialists. More speculative writers have sometimes described these figures as evidence of contact with unknown cultures or even non-human beings. Such interpretations are not supported by archaeological evidence. The unusual appearance of some figures can be approached through known possibilities: ritual clothing, body decoration, symbolic representation, artistic convention, or deliberate exaggeration. Prehistoric artists did not necessarily aim to create photographic images. Still, the ambiguity is genuine. Without written explanations, a figure that appears obvious to one researcher may have a completely different meaning to another. The most fascinating aspect of Oued Djerat may therefore be the landscape itself. The engravings are not isolated artworks placed randomly on stone. They belong to an environment that once had rivers, vegetation, animals, and human movement. The rock surfaces functioned within a living landscape. Perhaps the artists selected particular locations because of their proximity to water, routes, gathering places, or sacred areas. Or perhaps the choice was symbolic. We cannot yet know. What is certain is that the people who created these images possessed a detailed awareness of their environment. The animals are often depicted with enough anatomical accuracy to reveal familiarity. Their presence suggests observation, experience, and perhaps emotional or spiritual significance. The elephant was not an abstract idea. It was part of a world these people knew. The giraffe, rhinoceros, and cattle were not distant creatures from an imaginary realm. They belonged to environments that no longer exist in the same form. And this changes the way the engravings should be understood. They are not simply mysterious pictures carved into desert rocks. They are evidence of environmental transformation on a continental scale. A place that now appears almost lifeless once supported communities who watched large herds move across open grasslands and gathered around water sources that have long since disappeared. Then the climate shifted. The rivers weakened. The grasslands receded. The animals moved away or disappeared from the region. The people adapted, migrated, or changed their way of life. Yet their images remained. Today, Oued Djerat stands as a vast record of that transformation. But the voices behind the carvings are silent. Archaeology can establish approximate periods, identify animals, reconstruct climate patterns, and compare artistic styles. It can reveal what was present. It is much harder to determine what those images meant. Were they memories of successful hunts, religious symbols, territorial markers, stories preserved without writing, or perhaps a combination of all these functions, changing across generations? The answer may never be completely recovered. And somewhere among the thousands of engravings, beneath layers of weathering and sand, there may still be images that have not been documented or fully understood. The desert has preserved the evidence with extraordinary patience. But what exactly was Oued Djerat to the people who gathered there? And what forgotten meaning might still be waiting within the stone? From the rock engravings of Oued Djerat, where ancient images preserve memories of a greener Sahara, our journey now moves across the Mediterranean to the volcanic island of Santorini. Here, beneath layers of ash and pumice, an entire Bronze Age settlement remained sealed for more than 3,000 years. The ruins of Akrotiri emerge from the earth like a city interrupted in the middle of ordinary life. Stone buildings rise several stories high. Narrow streets pass between carefully constructed houses. Staircases lead toward upper rooms, while walls preserve vivid frescoes showing ships, animals, plants, landscapes, and people. Clay vessels remain scattered throughout the settlement, and storage rooms reveal traces of a society deeply connected to agriculture, craftsmanship, and maritime trade. Akrotiri was not a small, isolated village. During the Bronze Age, it appears to have been an important settlement within the Aegean world, flourishing roughly during the 2nd millennium BC. Its architecture and material culture reveal connections with Crete and other parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Then came the volcano. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, the Thera volcanic eruption buried the settlement beneath enormous quantities of ash and pumice. The eruption was one of the most powerful volcanic events of the ancient Mediterranean, dramatically reshaping the island. Yet Akrotiri presents an unusual archaeological puzzle. Unlike Pompeii, where victims were preserved in the aftermath of the eruption, archaeologists have found remarkably few human remains at Akrotiri. This suggests that many inhabitants may have recognized the warning signs and evacuated before the settlement was completely buried. Where did they go? And how much time did they have to leave? The archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement may have experienced earthquakes before the final eruption. Buildings show signs of seismic destruction and subsequent repair. Objects appear to have been moved or reorganized, perhaps as residents attempted to recover from earlier damage. This raises the possibility that the population had experienced volcanic disturbances before the final catastrophe. The island itself would have provided warnings. Earthquakes, ground movement, changes in water sources, and other environmental signals could have alerted inhabitants to unusual activity. Yet, the exact sequence of events remains difficult to reconstruct. The eruption itself was extraordinarily complex, It unfolded through several phases, producing ash, pumice, volcanic gases, and enormous destructive forces. The resulting deposits preserved buildings with remarkable detail, effectively creating a time capsule. But preservation does not guarantee understanding. The frescoes are among Akrotiri's greatest treasures, yet their meanings remain partly elusive. They depict ships, ceremonial scenes, animals, exotic plants, and landscapes. Some compositions appear to portray actual environments, while others may contain symbolic or religious elements. One famous series shows ships moving through a coastal landscape filled with settlements, vegetation, and human activity. Could these scenes represent a real journey? Perhaps. Some researchers have suggested that the paintings provide valuable information about Bronze Age maritime life and the landscapes known to Aegean communities. Others see deeper ceremonial or political meanings. The temptation to connect Akrotiri with Atlantis has also persisted. Plato described Atlantis as a wealthy island civilization destroyed by catastrophe, and the volcanic destruction of Thera has encouraged comparisons between the two stories. The resemblance is intriguing. An advanced maritime society, a powerful island environment, and a catastrophic destruction associated with the sea. But the chronological and textual problems are substantial. There is no archaeological evidence proving that Akrotiri was Atlantis, nor that Atlantis itself was a historical place. The connection remains a speculative interpretation rather than an established conclusion. What Akrotiri does demonstrate is that Bronze Age Aegean societies were capable of remarkable urban development. The buildings contained drainage systems, carefully planned streets, multiple stories, storage facilities, workshops, and sophisticated decorative art. Their inhabitants participated in extensive maritime networks, exchanging materials and cultural influences across the eastern Mediterranean. This raises another question. How did such a society respond to a disaster on this scale? The absence of large numbers of human remains suggests that evacuation may have been successful, at least for many residents. But where those people traveled, how they rebuilt their lives, and how the eruption affected neighboring communities remain difficult to determine. The catastrophe may also have had consequences far beyond Santorini. Ash and environmental disruption could have affected agriculture and maritime activity across parts of the Aegean. Some researchers have explored possible links between the eruption and broader political or economic changes in the region, although establishing direct cause and effect is extremely difficult. The destruction was not simply an ending. For archaeology, it became a form of preservation. The ash that devastated Akrotiri also protected it. Walls that would normally have collapsed beneath centuries of weathering remained sealed. Objects stayed where they had been abandoned. Paintings survived beneath layers of volcanic material. The city became a message from a world that no longer existed, and yet its inhabitants left without writing a final explanation. We do not know exactly what they saw in the final hours. We do not know whether the evacuation was orderly or chaotic, whether people expected to return, or whether some communities never understood the scale of what was coming. Today, visitors can walk through streets where Bronze Age residents once moved between houses and workshops. The silence is striking because the settlement still looks unfinished, as though its inhabitants simply stepped away and never returned. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery of Akrotiri. The volcano preserved the physical world with extraordinary clarity, but it could not preserve the thoughts of the people who lived there. Their houses remain, their paintings remain, their vessels remain, but the final moments of their story are still hidden beneath the ash. And as excavation continues around the ancient settlement, one question remains quietly suspended over Akrotiri. What else might still lie sealed beneath Santorini's volcanic layers, waiting to reveal what happened to the people who once called this extraordinary island home? From the volcanic silence of Akrotiri, our journey now moves south across the Mediterranean to the highlands of northeastern Algeria, where another ancient city lies remarkably exposed beneath the open sky. Here, among the Oris Mountains, the Roman ruins of Timgad spread across the landscape in a precise geometric pattern. Straight streets, stone buildings, arches, columns, and public squares preserved with an almost startling clarity. At first sight, Timgad seems less like a ruined city than the imprint of an ancient plan. The settlement was founded around AD 100 under the Roman Emperor Trajan, probably as a colony for military veterans. Its Latin name, Thamugadi, reflects its location within the Roman province of Numidia. Positioned near important routes through North Africa, the city became part of a broader network of Roman administration, agriculture, trade, and military activity. Its most remarkable feature is its organization. Timgad was laid out according to a highly structured urban plan, with streets intersecting at regular angles. The principal avenues crossed near the center, while public buildings, houses, shops, baths, and religious structures occupied carefully defined spaces. The famous Arch of Trajan once marked one of the major entrances to the city. Nearby stood a forum, theaters, temples, markets, and extensive public baths. Why would a Roman settlement on the edge of the empire require such an elaborate urban landscape? The conventional answer is straightforward. Timgad was a planned colonial city, designed to establish Roman institutions and provide land for veterans while strengthening Roman influence in the region. But the ruins reveal a more complicated story. As the city grew, it expanded beyond its original grid. Buildings were added, streets extended, and neighborhoods developed around the first planned settlement. What began as a carefully controlled urban design gradually became a living city shaped by changing needs. That transformation is visible in the architecture. A formal Roman plan existed alongside private houses, workshops, religious buildings, and later structures that did not always follow the original geometry. The city was therefore not frozen in a perfect grid. It evolved. Among the most intriguing discoveries are the remains of an enormous public bath complex. Timgad possessed several bathhouses, suggesting that bathing was not merely a private activity, but an important part of social life. The theater, capable of accommodating thousands of spectators, provides another indication of the city's scale and cultural life. And then there is the library. Timgad's ruins include the remains of a monumental building traditionally identified as a public library, probably dating to the 3rd century AD. Its existence suggests that intellectual and civic life had an important place within the city. Yet the precise function of every surviving structure is not always certain. Archaeologists often reconstruct buildings through architectural comparisons, inscriptions, artifacts, and spatial relationships. A structure that appears obvious from its shape may have served several functions over time. This is where some of Timgad's mysteries begin. Why did the city continue to invest in monumental public architecture even as political conditions across the Roman world became increasingly unstable? What happened to its population during the later centuries of Roman rule? And why was such a substantial urban center eventually abandoned? Timgad did not disappear suddenly. Evidence suggests that the city experienced periods of prosperity, transformation, disruption, and decline. During late antiquity, political and religious changes reshaped the settlement. Christianity became established, while older religious institutions declined or changed function. The city eventually suffered destruction and was gradually abandoned. Later, environmental processes buried parts of the ruins beneath soil and sediment, helping preserve them for centuries. This remarkable preservation has encouraged more imaginative interpretations. Some writers have described Timgad as an ancient, planned city, whose geometry supposedly reveals secret mathematical or astronomical knowledge. Others have suggested that its orientation and street pattern encode information extending beyond ordinary Roman urban planning. There is no compelling evidence for such hidden systems. Roman surveyors possessed sophisticated methods for planning settlements, measuring land, aligning streets, and organizing public space. Timgad's geometry can be understood within the broader tradition of Roman town planning, but the mathematical precision remains impressive. The city's layout demonstrates how deeply Roman administration depended upon measurement, standardization, and controlled organization. Perhaps the greater mystery is not how they achieved it, but how this carefully ordered city adapted to the unpredictable human world around it. People were born here. Families moved through its streets. Merchants opened shops. Citizens attended performances. Officials conducted business. Worshippers entered temples and later churches. The grid was orderly. Life was not. Over generations, inhabitants modified buildings, changed religious practices, repaired roads, and transformed spaces according to new circumstances. Beneath the apparent symmetry lies a much less predictable human story. Today, the ruins remain extraordinarily extensive. Columns still stand. Pavements preserve traces of ancient streets. The theater continues to dominate the landscape, while mosaics and inscriptions provide fragments of individual lives. Yet, many questions remain. The exact sequence of Timgad's later decline is not fully understood. Some structures remain difficult to interpret, while the lives of the ordinary inhabitants are far less visible than those of officials and wealthy citizens. And perhaps this is the quiet mystery of Timgad. The city appears almost perfectly legible from above, yet the human story within its geometric streets remains incomplete. A Roman planner could determine where a road should run, where a forum should stand, and where a theater should rise. But no plan could predict how generations would change the city. The stones preserve the architecture. They preserve fragments of names and institutions. They preserve the outline of a society that once seemed permanent. But they cannot tell us exactly why its people finally left. As the evening light moves across Timgad's silent streets, the geometry remains remarkably intact, while the world that created it has disappeared. And somewhere beneath the soil, beneath later layers of occupation and collapse, additional evidence may still remain, waiting to reveal whether the final chapter of Timgad was shaped primarily by political upheaval, economic decline, environmental change, or a combination of forces that archaeology has yet to fully reconstruct. From the ordered streets of Timgad, our journey now turns toward an object far smaller in scale, yet remarkably dense with meaning. In a museum in Piacenza, northern Italy, lies a bronze model of a sheep's liver covered with dozens of engraved compartments and inscriptions. It is known as the liver of Piacenza, and more than 2,000 years after it was made, scholars are still studying what its intricate markings reveal about Etruscan religion. The object was discovered in 1877 near Chiavazzaro, close to Piacenza. It is generally dated to the late 2nd or early 1st century BC, although its precise context and purpose remain subjects of scholarly discussion. At first glance, the object seems almost anatomical. It follows the general shape of a sheep's liver, complete with divisions corresponding broadly to the organ's physical structure. But the surface is not concerned with anatomy alone. It is divided into numerous sections, each associated with inscriptions naming Etruscan deities. This was not simply a model. It appears to have been an instructional or ritual object connected with haruspicy, the practice of examining the internal organs of sacrificed animals to interpret divine intentions. For the Etruscans, the liver was not merely an organ. It could function as a symbolic map of the divine world. A trained diviner, known as a haruspex, examined the liver of a sacrificed animal, paying attention to its shape, markings, irregularities, and specific regions. These observations were interpreted as signs communicated by the gods. The liver of Piacenza may therefore represent an attempt to organize this complex system into a physical diagram. But why a liver? And how could a biological organ become a map of the heavens? The answer may lie in an ancient belief that the human and divine worlds were interconnected through signs. The body of the sacrificial animal became a medium through which divine messages could be interpreted. The liver model may have helped practitioners understand which portions of the organ corresponded to particular deities or areas of divine influence. Its inscriptions provide some of the strongest evidence. Names associated with Etruscan gods appear across the surface, including figures connected with different regions of the Etruscan religious system. The arrangement is not random. The divisions appear carefully organized, suggesting a structured method of interpretation. Yet, the exact system remains difficult to reconstruct. The Etruscan language is only partially understood. Although scholars can read many Etruscan inscriptions, the surviving vocabulary and grammar are limited compared with those of Latin or Greek. As a result, the names and divisions on the liver can be identified with reasonable confidence, while the precise rules governing their interpretation remain less certain. This creates an unusual archaeological problem. We possess the diagram. We can identify many of its labels. We understand the general religious practice associated with it, but the complete operating instructions are missing. Imagine finding a complex scientific chart without the manual explaining how its symbols should be read. That is, in part, the situation with the liver of Piacenza. Some researchers have compared it with other ancient traditions of divination, particularly practices documented in Mesopotamia. Clay models of animal livers from ancient Mesopotamia demonstrate that the concept of dividing the liver into zones for divinatory interpretation existed much earlier in the Near East. This has raised questions about cultural connections. Did Etruscan divination develop independently, or did ideas travel westward through long-distance contacts across the Mediterranean? The broader Mediterranean world was interconnected through trade, migration, warfare, and cultural exchange. Similar religious concepts could spread across considerable distances. More speculative interpretations sometimes go further, proposing that the Etruscan liver preserves evidence of an ancient astronomical system disguised as anatomy. Some writers have suggested that the divisions correspond not only to deities but also to celestial regions, constellations, or cosmic principles. There are genuine reasons to explore relationships between Etruscan religion and the sky. Ancient Mediterranean cultures frequently connected divine activity with celestial phenomena. But the more elaborate claims about hidden astronomical codes remain difficult to establish. The object itself offers no simple explanation. Its makers created something that occupies an unusual space between anatomy, theology, ritual practice, and symbolic geography. Perhaps its purpose was practical, a training device for a diviner. Perhaps it functioned as a ritual reference object. Or perhaps it represented a broader cosmological concept in which the physical body reflected the structure of the divine universe. The answer may have changed depending on how it was used. What makes the liver of Piacenza particularly valuable is that it provides a rare physical glimpse into an intellectual system that otherwise survives mainly through scattered inscriptions and later descriptions. The Etruscans left monumental tombs, elaborate artwork, temples, and inscriptions, but much of their religious literature has disappeared. Their sacred books were known to later Roman writers, yet the original texts have not survived. So, the bronze liver becomes more than an isolated artifact. It is one surviving fragment of a much larger body of knowledge. It hints at rules that once guided trained specialists. It preserves divine names and a structured arrangement of sacred space. It demonstrates that Etruscan religious thought was systematic, rather than simply a collection of disconnected rituals. And yet, the bronze surface remains silent about the most important question. What did a haruspex actually see when examining a real liver? How did the practitioner translate a physical mark into a divine message? Was there a standardized system, or did interpretation depend heavily on individual expertise and circumstances? We can reconstruct pieces of the process, but the experience itself is gone. Today, the liver of Piacenza remains a small bronze object with an enormous intellectual shadow. Its engraved compartments preserve a religious system whose full logic has not survived. Perhaps somewhere in another tomb, sanctuary, or forgotten collection lies another object capable of clarifying the missing pieces. Until such evidence appears, the bronze liver remains an ancient map without a complete legend, an artifact that tells us the Etruscans possessed a sophisticated method of reading divine signs, while leaving us to wonder how much of that hidden system has been permanently lost. From the bronze liver that preserved a fragment of Etruscan religious thought, our journey now returns to Sicily, where an entire landscape of cliffs and burial chambers reveals a very different expression of the ancient world. Deep within southeastern Sicily, the Anapo River cuts through a rugged canyon, creating steep limestone walls covered with thousands of small openings. At first glance, they appear almost like windows, but these openings are tombs. The site is known as Pantalica, one of the largest prehistoric necropolises in Europe. More than 5,000 rock-cut chamber tombs are scattered across the cliffs, creating an extraordinary archaeological landscape in which the boundary between natural rock and human construction becomes difficult to separate. The earliest major occupation of Pantalica dates to the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, roughly between the 13th and 7th centuries BC. The communities who lived here belonged to prehistoric Sicily before the emergence of the Greek colonies that would later transform the island. Their settlements are now partly ruined or concealed by vegetation. Their tombs, however, remain. Thousands of chambers were carved directly into the limestone. Most are relatively small, with simple entrances leading into rock-cut spaces where the dead were placed. Why create such an enormous cemetery in the cliffs? The practical explanation is straightforward. Pantalica's limestone plateau offered a naturally defensible environment, while the surrounding valleys provided access to water and agricultural resources. The cliffs also offered abundant stone suitable for cutting burial chambers. But the scale is difficult to ignore. Thousands of tombs suggest a substantial population occupying the region for generations. The necropolis was not created by a single community at one moment. It developed gradually as different generations continued using and expanding the burial landscape. The result is something unusual. Pantalica is simultaneously a cemetery, a settlement, and a landscape shaped by repeated human activity. Archaeological evidence suggests that people lived on the plateau above the river valleys, while the tombs were cut into the surrounding cliffs. The settlement itself appears to have included substantial structures, although much has been lost through erosion, later activity, and vegetation. The tombs provide some of the clearest evidence. Artifacts recovered from them include pottery, bronze objects, weapons, ornaments, and other materials that help archaeologists reconstruct the chronology and cultural connections of the community. Some objects reveal contact with other parts of Sicily and the wider Mediterranean. This is important because prehistoric Sicily was not isolated. Communities exchanged materials and ideas across the island and beyond. Metal objects, ceramics, and stylistic influences reveal connections that extend beyond Pantalica itself. Yet, the people who created this landscape left behind no surviving written history describing their society. Their identity must therefore be reconstructed through archaeology. What did they believe about death? What rituals accompanied burial? Did the tombs belong to individual families, social groups, or wider communities? And why did the cliffs become such an important place for the dead? The answers are incomplete. The sheer number of tombs suggests that burial was deeply integrated into community life, but the precise rituals remain difficult to reconstruct. Archaeologists can study the arrangement of remains and objects, but beliefs are much harder to recover. Some speculative interpretations have suggested that the caves may have possessed astronomical or sacred significance beyond their funerary purpose. Others have imagined elaborate rituals involving the surrounding cliffs, river valleys, and changing sunlight. There is currently no strong evidence establishing such interpretations. Still, the landscape itself invites them. Pantalica is not a flat cemetery laid out according to a simple geometric plan. The tombs follow the contours of the cliffs. Their entrances face different directions. Paths move through ravines and across plateaus. Water flows through the valleys below. The entire environment may have shaped how the inhabitants understood the relationship between life, death, and place. Perhaps the tombs were meant to remain visible to the living. Perhaps the dead were deliberately placed within the landscape rather than separated from it. Or perhaps the arrangement developed gradually through practical decisions rather than a single religious design. Another mystery concerns the settlement's eventual transformation. By the early Iron Age, Pantalica was an important center in southeastern Sicily. Later, Greek colonization changed the political and cultural landscape of the island. Nearby Syracuse became one of the most powerful Greek cities in the Mediterranean. Pantalica's importance declined. Yet the site was not simply erased. Its cliffs, tombs, and valleys continued to exist, even as the society that created them disappeared from historical memory. Centuries later, new populations would inhabit parts of the region, sometimes reusing caves and pathways. The landscape therefore accumulated layers of human history. Today, the necropolis remains one of the most extraordinary prehistoric landscapes in Europe. Walking through the valleys, the tomb entrances appear everywhere. High on cliff faces, clustered together, sometimes separated by only a few meters. Their repetition creates an almost overwhelming impression. Thousands of openings, thousands of burials, thousands of lives that can no longer be individually identified. And yet, each chamber once represented a person or a group of people important enough to receive a place within this enduring landscape. Perhaps that is where the deeper mystery lies. The archaeological record tells us that Pantalica was inhabited, organized, connected to wider Mediterranean networks, and deeply concerned with burial. But the emotional world behind those decisions has largely disappeared. We can count the tombs, we can date the artifacts, we can reconstruct the settlement, but we cannot hear the words spoken when the dead were placed inside the stone chambers. And as the Anapo River continues to wind through the canyon below, thousands of silent tombs remain embedded in the cliffs, leaving one question suspended within the landscape. What did the people of Pantalica believe would remain after their lives were gone, and what part of that belief is still waiting to be understood? From the thousands of tombs carved into the cliffs of Pantalica, our journey now moves westward to northern Morocco, where a very different funerary landscape stands beneath the open sky. Near the village of Choamra, not far from Asila, a broad stone monument known as Dolmen de Mzoura rises from the surrounding countryside. Its weathered stones form an enormous circular arrangement, with a striking central burial monument at its heart. The site is unusual even by the standards of prehistoric North Africa. Mzoura consists of a large ring of standing stones surrounding a central tumulus, or burial mound. More than 160 stones have been documented around the perimeter, although the monument has suffered damage and alteration over centuries. Some of the uprights are relatively modest, while others rise prominently above the surrounding ground. At the center lies the tumulus. For a long time, the monument's purpose and date were difficult to establish. Its appearance encouraged comparisons with megalithic monuments elsewhere in the Mediterranean and Europe, while its location in Morocco placed it within a very different cultural landscape. What kind of community built such a structure? And why was so much effort invested in arranging heavy stones around a single mound? The most widely accepted interpretation connects Mzoura with a prehistoric funerary tradition. Archaeological research has identified the monument as a tumulus surrounded by a stone circle, with evidence suggesting construction during the first millennium BC or possibly earlier phases of North African prehistory. The exact chronology, however, remains debated. This uncertainty matters because Mzoura cannot simply be assigned to a single culture based on appearance alone. Megalithic monuments occur across many regions, but similar architectural forms do not necessarily indicate direct contact or a common origin. Stone circles can emerge independently when communities use local materials and shared concepts of monumentality. At Mzoura, the landscape itself may have been part of the design. The monument stands on relatively open ground, making the arrangement visible from a distance. The circle creates a defined boundary around the central mound, separating the burial area from the surrounding terrain. Perhaps this was a symbolic division between the world of the living and the resting place of the dead. Or perhaps the circle had a more practical role. Without written records, we cannot know. The stones themselves add another layer of intrigue. Some are unusually tall and slender, while others appear more irregular. Their arrangement is not perfectly uniform, suggesting that the builders were not simply constructing a geometric circle according to modern mathematical standards. Yet, there was clearly organization. The stones were selected, transported, positioned, and maintained by people capable of mobilizing considerable labor. That alone tells us something about the society responsible. A monument of this scale requires cooperation. Someone had to determine where it would stand. Others had to prepare the ground, move the stones, construct the central mound, and perhaps organize ceremonies associated with the burial. What kind of authority made such a project possible? Was it a chief's tomb? A monument for an important ancestor? A sacred place serving an entire community? Archaeological evidence can narrow the possibilities, but it cannot yet provide a definitive answer. The monument has also attracted more imaginative interpretations. Some writers have associated Mzoura with ancient accounts of a monumental tomb attributed to the legendary giant Antaeus. The connection is particularly interesting because Greek and Roman authors described Antaeus as a powerful figure associated with North Africa and the region of ancient Mauritania. Later traditions linked monumental remains in the area with his burial. But these accounts belong to a mythological and literary tradition rather than direct archaeological evidence. There is no established proof that Mzoura was the tomb of Antaeus. Still, the persistence of the association reveals something about how ancient landscapes acquire stories. A large, enigmatic monument without a surviving explanation can easily become connected with legendary figures whose scale seems appropriate to the stones. Other speculative theories have proposed that Mzoura reflects contacts with Atlantic or European megalithic traditions, or that its arrangement served an astronomical function. Some alignments at prehistoric monuments can indeed relate to solar or lunar events, and ancient communities were capable of careful observation of celestial cycles. But the presence of a circular arrangement alone does not demonstrate an astronomical purpose. At Mzoura, the evidence is not sufficient to establish a sophisticated celestial observatory. The possibility of astronomical awareness, however, remains worth separating from more dramatic claims. A prehistoric community could have observed the movement of the sun without possessing a formal astronomical system. The orientation of a monument could have been meaningful without functioning as a precise calendar. This distinction is essential. The real monument is already remarkable enough. Mzoura represents a form of monumental construction that emerged in a region whose prehistoric history remains less documented than that of Egypt, Greece, or Rome. Its builders left no written explanation of their intentions, yet they transformed an ordinary patch of land into a carefully defined ceremonial landscape. Over time, the original meaning disappeared. The stones remained. Later populations encountered the monument without necessarily knowing why it had been built. Stories could then grow around it, connecting the physical remains with legendary rulers, giants, ancestors, or distant peoples. Today, Mzoura still stands as an archaeological question written in stone. The circle tells us that the monument mattered. The central mound suggests a funerary connection. The scale reveals organized labor, but the identity of the person or community at its center remains uncertain, as does the full ritual significance of the surrounding stones. Perhaps future excavations will clarify its chronology, or reveal additional evidence about the people who constructed it. Perhaps the monument will remain one of those rare sites where archaeology can reconstruct the physical structure far more clearly than the beliefs that gave it meaning. And as the Moroccan landscape stretches quietly around the weathered stones, another possibility lingers. Not that Mzoura conceals some extraordinary lost civilization, but that its simplest story may be the one we have not yet recovered. Who was remembered beneath the central mound? What ceremonies once took place around the stone circle? And how much of the meaning carried by those ancient stones has disappeared forever, leaving only their silent arrangement to tell us that someone, long ago, believed this place was worth remembering. The monument consists of a long, low mound of stone and earth, its weathered surface rising gently from the surrounding landscape. At first, it can appear almost natural, a subtle ridge shaped by centuries of wind and rain. But inside the cairn is a carefully constructed passage leading toward a central burial chamber. The structure is a Neolithic chambered cairn, generally dated to the 4th millennium BC. It belongs to a much broader tradition of prehistoric monuments found throughout northern Britain, where communities constructed large stone burial sites for the dead. Yet, Camster is unusual in both its preservation and its design. The site actually consists of two major prehistoric cairns, commonly known as the Camster Long Cairn and Camster Round Cairn. Their forms differ, but both contain internal chambers constructed from large slabs of stone. To enter the restored chamber of Camster Round Cairn is to experience something quite different from viewing an ordinary archaeological ruin. The entrance narrows. The surrounding light gradually disappears. Then the passage opens into a small stone chamber. For the people who built it thousands of years ago, this transition may have carried profound meaning. Was the movement from open landscape into darkness symbolic? Did the chamber represent a place where the living encountered the dead? Or was the architecture shaped primarily by practical funerary traditions whose deeper significance has been lost? Archaeologists can identify the monument's construction methods and compare it with other chambered cairns, but the beliefs of its builders remain much harder to reconstruct. The communities responsible for Camster lived during the Neolithic period, long before written records existed in Britain. They farmed, raised animals, gathered resources, shaped stone, and participated in networks that extended across considerable distances. Their lives were not entirely isolated. Stone tools, pottery, and other archaeological evidence show that prehistoric communities exchanged materials and ideas. Yet, each region developed distinctive architectural traditions. Camster belongs to the northern tradition of chambered tombs, where large stones were carefully arranged to create internal spaces within substantial cairns. The engineering is impressive. Massive slabs had to be quarried or collected, transported, positioned, and stabilized. The mound itself required large quantities of stone and earth. This was collective work. Why invest so much labor in a place intended for the dead? Perhaps the monument was not simply a tomb. It may have been a place where communities gathered, remembered ancestors, performed ceremonies, or reaffirmed relationships between generations. Evidence from chambered cairns elsewhere suggests that some monuments were used repeatedly over long periods. Human remains could be placed inside, moved, rearranged, or added to over time. The dead may therefore have remained part of community life rather than being permanently separated from it. At Camster, however, the surviving evidence does not allow us to reconstruct every stage of ritual activity. The darkness of the interior has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some have proposed that chambered cairns were designed to represent symbolic journeys, perhaps reflecting ideas about death, rebirth, or movement between different realms. Others have suggested astronomical significance, pointing to the orientation of entrances and the changing position of sunlight during particular seasons. Such possibilities deserve careful consideration, but they should not be mistaken for established facts. Prehistoric builders were certainly capable of observing the seasonal movement of the sun. Agriculture would have made the annual cycle important, but an alignment alone does not prove that a monument functioned as an astronomical instrument. There is another intriguing feature of Camster. The monument was built into the landscape rather than simply placed upon it. Its relationship with the surrounding hills, open ground, and distant horizon would have influenced how it was experienced. For someone approaching the cairn thousands of years ago, the monument may have been visible from a considerable distance. Then, after entering, the experience changed completely. Outside, wind, sky, open terrain. Inside, stone, darkness, confined space. That contrast may have been deliberate. Perhaps the builders understood architecture as a way of transforming perception itself. The cairn created a passage from one environment into another, and the movement through that passage may have carried ritual significance. But eventually, the ceremonies ended. The monument ceased to receive new burials or offerings. The people who understood its symbolism disappeared. Generations passed, languages changed, and the meaning of the stones became increasingly remote. Yet, the structure survived. Its preservation offers modern archaeology an extraordinary opportunity. The passage, chamber, construction techniques, and surrounding landscape can still be examined. Comparisons with other Neolithic monuments can help researchers reconstruct the broader traditions of prehistoric northern Scotland. But there is a limit to what stones can tell us. We may know approximately when Camster was built. We can study how it was constructed. We can identify its relationship to a wider tradition of chambered tombs. What we cannot recover with certainty is the thought that passed through the mind of the person entering that chamber for the first time. Did they fear the darkness? Did they regard it as sacred? Did they believe the dead remained present within the stone? Or was the monument understood through a completely different set of ideas that modern archaeology can only approach indirectly? Today, the Cairn of Camster remains quiet against the northern landscape, its stone passage still leading into darkness, much as it did thousands of years ago. The monument has survived remarkably well. Its builders did not. And somewhere between those two facts lies the enduring mystery of Camster. How much of the meaning once carried through that narrow passage has been preserved in the stones, and how much disappeared with the people who built it? Stone walls follow the contours of a narrow headland overlooking the ocean. Behind them, the remains of circular and oval structures form the outlines of an ancient settlement. Waves strike the rocks below, while the Atlantic stretches toward the horizon in every direction. This was not simply a collection of isolated houses. Castro de Baronia was a fortified Iron Age settlement, or Castro, belonging to the distinctive archaeological tradition of northwestern Iberia. Its occupation is generally associated with the later centuries of the first millennium BC, with evidence suggesting continued use into the early Roman period. The location appears almost deliberately chosen for defense. The settlement occupies a rocky promontory connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land. Defensive walls and other barriers restricted access, while the steep cliffs provided natural protection along much of the perimeter. Why establish a community here? The obvious answer is security. A settlement surrounded by water and cliffs would have been difficult to approach from several directions. The walls reinforced those natural defenses, creating a protected environment for the people who lived inside. But defense alone may not explain the choice. The Atlantic was not merely a threat. It was also a source of food, movement, and connection. The inhabitants of Castro de Barogna lived within a coastal environment rich in marine resources. Shellfish, fish, and other coastal foods could have supplemented agriculture and livestock. The sea may also have connected communities along the Galician coast and beyond. This creates an interesting contradiction. The settlement looks isolated, yet its position may actually have placed it within a much larger network. The word Castro refers broadly to fortified settlements characteristic of northwestern Iberia, particularly Galicia and northern Portugal. Hundreds of such sites are known across the region, although they differ considerably in size, layout, chronology, and function. Castro de Barogna is among the most visually striking. Its stone houses were predominantly circular or rounded in plan, a characteristic frequently associated with Iron Age settlements in this region. Some structures appear to have been domestic buildings, while others may have served different purposes. There is no surviving written account from the inhabitants explaining how the settlement was organized. Archaeology must reconstruct their society through walls, pottery, tools, animal remains, metal objects, and the arrangement of the settlement itself. And the deeper researchers look, the less simple the picture becomes. For many years, fortified settlements were often interpreted primarily as defensive strongholds belonging to communities constantly threatened by warfare. That interpretation may contain part of the truth, but a wall does not necessarily mean a settlement existed under permanent military pressure. Defensive architecture can also express social identity, control movement, protect valuable resources, or mark the boundary between a community and the outside world. At Barogna, the entrance itself seems significant. Access to the settlement was restricted, requiring movement through controlled approaches before reaching the inhabited area. Such arrangements could have provided security, but they may also have shaped everyday social experience. Who was allowed to enter? Who controlled the gates? Were visitors merchants, travelers, relatives, or potential enemies? The archaeological record cannot answer every question. The houses provide another clue. Their circular forms contrast with the rectangular architecture that would later become common under Roman influence. The circular house was part of a wider architectural tradition across the Atlantic regions of Iberia. Inside these structures, inhabitants would have cooked, stored food, worked materials, and slept. Yet, the surviving foundations reveal very little about the emotional world of those who occupied them. A settlement can tell us how people built. It is harder to determine how they thought. Some interpretations have emphasized the possibility of strong social hierarchies within Iron Age castros. Monumental walls and carefully organized spaces may reflect communities with leaders capable of coordinating substantial labor. Other researchers have stressed household-based organization and networks of relatively autonomous communities. The truth may have varied from settlement to settlement. Castro de Barogna itself may have changed considerably during its occupation. Different generations could have rebuilt walls, altered houses, changed entrances, or adapted spaces for new purposes. What appears to us as a single settlement may actually represent several phases of occupation layered together. Then, there is the question of the settlement's relationship with the Roman world. Roman expansion into northwestern Iberia transformed the region during the late 1st millennium BC. Military campaigns, administrative changes, new economic systems, and cultural interactions gradually altered local societies. Castro de Barogna appears to have been occupied during this period of transition. Did its inhabitants resist Roman authority? Did they cooperate with it? Did Roman influence gradually change their way of life? The evidence does not provide a simple narrative. Some Iron Age communities in northwestern Iberia were eventually integrated into the Roman provincial system, while others experienced disruption or decline. Roman influence did not necessarily mean the immediate disappearance of local traditions. Architecture, pottery, religious practices, and settlement patterns could persist for generations. This makes the final history of Barogna particularly interesting. The settlement was eventually abandoned, but exactly why remains difficult to establish. Was the community displaced by political change? Did economic conditions shift? Did new Roman settlements and roads reduce the importance of the coastal stronghold? Or did inhabitants simply relocate as social patterns changed? There is no single piece of evidence that provides a definitive answer. The location has also encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some writers have imagined the settlement as a sanctuary, a maritime observation post, or even a place associated with ancient Atlantic religious traditions. The spectacular setting makes such theories appealing. Yet, archaeology provides stronger evidence for a fortified settlement with domestic activity than for an extraordinary ceremonial complex. That does not make the site ordinary. Quite the opposite. Its importance lies precisely in what it reveals about everyday life in a poorly documented period of European history. The people of Barogna built walls that required collective effort. They lived in circular houses. They depended on a landscape that offered both agricultural possibilities and abundant marine resources. They interacted with neighboring communities and eventually encountered the expanding Roman world. And they chose to build their settlement where land meets ocean. Standing among the ruins today, it is easy to focus on the dramatic scenery. But the more revealing details are smaller. A fragment of pottery, a section of wall, the outline of a doorway, the remains of a hearth. Each represents an ordinary action performed by someone whose name has been forgotten. Someone entered through that doorway. Someone prepared food beside that hearth. Someone repaired the wall after years of Atlantic weather. Someone stood at the edge of the settlement and looked toward the same horizon visitors see today. Yet, we still know surprisingly little about those people themselves. The walls survive. Their voices do not. And perhaps that is what makes Castro de Barogna so compelling. It is not a monument whose builders left behind an explanation. It is a settlement whose meaning must be reconstructed from fragments, while the Atlantic continues to surround it much as it did during the Iron Age. The stones can tell us where people lived. They can suggest how they protected themselves and how they organized their homes, but they cannot tell us what they feared, what they believed, or why the final inhabitants eventually walked away. And as the tide moves around the ancient promontory, one question remains quietly unresolved. What happened during the final days of Castro de Barogna, and what evidence might still lie hidden beneath the soil, waiting to reveal how this Atlantic community met the changing world around it? The landscape around Acoustic is stark and beautiful. Pale volcanic rock rises across the horizon, while the Melendez River cuts through the valley below. Today, the region appears relatively quiet, but during the early Neolithic period, this was a place of sustained human activity. At Höyük, layers of mud brick buildings accumulated over generations until they formed the mound visible today. The settlement was occupied roughly between 8,200 and 7,400 BC, making it one of the earliest known permanent or semi-permanent settlements in central Anatolia. Its inhabitants lived thousands of years before writing, before cities in the later Mesopotamian sense, and long before the monumental architecture associated with Egypt or classical civilizations. Yet their lives were already becoming surprisingly complex. People were constructing houses. They were processing plants and animals. They were making stone tools. They were controlling fire. They were burying their dead. And they were repeatedly returning to the same place, rebuilding their homes over earlier structures. This is where the story of Ashukla becomes particularly important. For much of human prehistory, archaeologists once imagined a relatively straightforward transition from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farming communities. Ashukla complicates that picture. The inhabitants did not suddenly abandon one lifestyle and adopt another. Instead, the evidence suggests a gradual process involving experimentation, environmental adaptation, animal management, changing diets, and increasingly permanent settlement. The people of Ashukla were part of a broader transformation taking place across Southwest Asia. Wild plants were being cultivated. Animals were increasingly managed. Communities were spending longer periods in particular locations. But agriculture did not appear fully formed. At Ashukla, archaeologists have found evidence of a mixed economy involving hunting, gathering, plant use, and animal management. Sheep and goats became increasingly important, but the process of domestication was complex and unfolded over generations. This raises an intriguing question. When does a wild animal become a domesticated one? There is no single moment when the transformation occurs. Instead, it can involve repeated human choices: which animals are hunted, which are kept alive, which are moved, which are bred, and which characteristics become advantageous within a human-controlled environment. Ashukla provides evidence for this gradual process. The settlement therefore offers something more valuable than a simple answer to the question of where agriculture began. It shows the uncertainty of the transition itself. Inside the settlement, houses were constructed from mud brick and arranged closely together. Their walls were repaired, rebuilt, and sometimes replaced. Over time, new buildings were constructed over earlier ones. The result was a layered settlement. One generation lived above another. A floor could eventually become buried beneath a later floor. A wall could be dismantled and replaced. A household space could change function as the community evolved. This creates an unusual archaeological record. The settlement is not simply a snapshot. It is a sequence of human decisions preserved one above another. The houses themselves are fascinating. Many appear to have been organized around internal spaces where cooking, craft production, storage, and other activities took place. Hearths and work areas provide clues about domestic life. But the arrangement of the settlement raises another question. Why did people choose to live so closely together? Crowding creates advantages. It can improve security, facilitate cooperation, and make shared resources easier to manage. But it also creates problems. Waste accumulates. Disease can spread more easily. Animals and people occupy the same environment. Privacy becomes limited. At Ashukla, archaeological evidence suggests that inhabitants developed ways of dealing with these challenges. The settlement was not simply an accidental cluster of huts. It was a social environment requiring rules, routines, and cooperation. And then there is the evidence of disease and physical stress. Human remains from Ashukla have allowed researchers to examine aspects of health, diet, injury, and daily activity. Some individuals show evidence of strenuous physical labor and other stresses associated with early settled life. This is important because permanent settlement did not necessarily make life easier. The transition to village life brought advantages, but it also created new pressures. People spent more time in close proximity. They handled animals. They processed food in shared environments. They performed repetitive tasks. Their skeletons can preserve traces of this lifestyle. In that sense, Ashikla gives us an unusually intimate glimpse into the cost of becoming settled. The bones are not merely evidence of disease or injury, they are evidence of adaptation. A community was learning how to live in a new social and ecological environment. One of the most intriguing aspects of Ashikla is the treatment of the dead. Burials occurred within the settlement, beneath house floors, or in spaces associated with domestic architecture. This practice is known from several early Neolithic communities in the region. It suggests that the dead remained physically connected to the places where the living continued their daily lives. Imagine living in a house knowing that people who came before you were buried beneath its floor. The boundary between household and cemetery would have been very different from what many modern societies consider normal. The dead may have remained part of the social memory of the household. Ancestors could have been physically present within the architecture. Yet, it would be dangerous to assign a specific religious belief without evidence. Archaeologists can identify burial patterns. They can study body position, grave goods, age, sex, and spatial relationships. But they cannot directly recover the beliefs associated with those practices. Were the buried individuals ancestors? Were they honored relatives? Were some burials associated with particular rituals? Did the meaning of burial change over time? These questions remain open. Ashikla also contains evidence of craft production. Stone tools were essential to daily life, and the inhabitants worked materials available from the surrounding region. Obsidian, in particular, was valuable. Volcanic landscapes provided access to high-quality obsidian sources, and artifacts made from this sharp volcanic glass have been found in many early Neolithic contexts across Anatolia and neighboring regions. Obsidian can be fractured into extremely sharp edges. For prehistoric communities, it was an important material for cutting, scraping, hunting, and other activities. At Ashiklu, its presence also hints at networks of movement and exchange. People were not necessarily confined to the settlement. They traveled across the landscape. They obtained raw materials. They encountered other communities. Ideas and objects could move with them. This is one reason the settlement should not be viewed as an isolated experiment. Ashikla belonged to a wider transformation occurring across Anatolia and the Near East. Nearby sites such as Höyük, later Neolithic communities and other early settlements reveal different versions of increasingly complex village life. But Ashikla is earlier. Its inhabitants were living during a period when the foundations of settled society were still being developed, and that makes some of its architectural features especially intriguing. Archaeologists have identified evidence for repeated rebuilding and changes in building practices. Certain structures appear to have had specialized functions, although interpretations remain cautious. There are also traces of unusual activities involving plastered surfaces, animal remains, and carefully arranged spaces. Some researchers have suggested that particular buildings may have served communal or ritual purposes. Others interpret the evidence more conservatively as reflecting domestic or craft activities. The disagreement is revealing. A building does not announce its purpose. A room with unusual objects may have been sacred, or it may have been a workshop. A carefully maintained surface may have held symbolic importance, or it may simply have been practical. Without written explanations, archaeology has to work through probabilities. This uncertainty has also encouraged more speculative interpretations. Ashikla is sometimes presented in popular literature as evidence for a sudden leap in human intelligence or the appearance of advanced social organization almost overnight. The archaeological evidence does not support such a dramatic scenario. The settlement developed over many generations. Its architecture reflects experimentation rather than a single revolutionary invention. Its economy combines older practices with emerging forms of food production. Its social organization appears increasingly complex, but there is no evidence that an unknown civilization suddenly introduced these developments. The reality is more interesting. Human societies can change gradually while still producing remarkable transformations. A community does not need advanced technology to create something historically important. Sometimes, the most significant development is simply learning how to remain in one place. At Ashiklu, that decision transformed nearly everything. Food production changed. Animal relationships changed. Architecture changed. Burial practices changed. Social relationships changed. The physical body changed. And the landscape itself became part of human life in a new way. The settlement was not merely occupying the environment, it was reshaping it. Houses were rebuilt repeatedly. Paths developed. Waste accumulated. Animals were incorporated into daily life. Plants were managed. Resources were extracted and transported. Over generations, the human presence became increasingly permanent. But permanence was never guaranteed. Environmental conditions could change. Resources could become less reliable. Social relationships could shift. New settlements could emerge. A community that had remained in one location for centuries could eventually disappear. Ashiklu eventually ceased to function as a living settlement around the middle of the 8th millennium BC. But its abandonment was not the end of the story. The mound remained. Later landscapes formed around it. Soil accumulated over its architecture. The settlement gradually became hidden. Thousands of years passed before archaeologists began exposing its remains. And now, the strange experience of Ashiklu is reversed. The people who once worked to make their settlement permanent have become invisible. Their houses have been excavated, their tools have been catalogued, their bones have been studied, their diets have been reconstructed. But the individuals themselves remain almost entirely anonymous. One person may have walked along the river at dawn. Another may have shaped an obsidian blade. Someone else may have prepared food beside a hearth. A child may have played among the narrow spaces between houses. These ordinary moments are almost impossible to recover. Yet fragments remain, a footprint, a damaged tool, a burial, a hearth, a fragment of plaster, a bone bearing evidence of physical stress. Together, they create a portrait of a community standing at one of the great turning points in human history. Ashiklu does not reveal a mysterious lost empire or an unknown technological civilization. Its mystery is quieter. It concerns how human beings learned to live together in permanent communities, how they altered their relationships with animals and landscapes, and how those changes reshaped their bodies, diets, homes, and beliefs. Perhaps the most difficult question is not why Ashiklu was built, but why its inhabitants chose to remain. What made this place worth returning to generation after generation? Was it the river, the obsidian, the animals, the fertile surroundings, the relationships that had formed within the settlement? Or had the community itself become the most valuable resource of all? We may never know precisely what those early inhabitants believed when they looked across the Melendez Valley. But their settlement remains, layer upon layer, preserving the consequences of decisions made more than 10,000 years ago. And somewhere within those compact houses, buried floors, forgotten pathways, and carefully arranged graves, the archaeological record may still contain another clue to one of humanity's oldest transformations. When did a temporary home become a permanent world? And what did people have to sacrifice to make it so? High above the modern city of Luxor, the limestone cliffs of the Theban necropolis rise in pale layers beneath the Egyptian sun. For thousands of years, These hills concealed tombs belonging to officials, priests, artisans, and members of the royal administration. Among them was a modest tomb identified as TT8, the burial place of a man named Ka and his wife, Merit. Unlike the vast royal monuments associated with pharaohs, Ka's tomb was relatively small. But when archaeologists entered it in 1906, they encountered something extraordinary. The burial chamber had remained remarkably intact. Inside were beds, stools, boxes, clothing, food containers, tools, cosmetics, furniture, and other objects that offered an unusually detailed glimpse into the private world of an elite Egyptian household during the New Kingdom. The discovery was made by an Italian archaeological expedition led by Ernesto Schiaparelli. What they found was not simply a collection of funerary objects. It was almost a room frozen in time. Ka was not a king. He was not even a member of the royal family. He appears to have been a highly respected official responsible for supervising royal construction projects, particularly in the area around Deir el-Medina, the settlement where skilled workers involved in the construction and decoration of royal tombs lived. His titles suggest that he held important responsibilities connected with royal building projects. That position placed him close to the machinery of pharaonic power. But the objects found inside his tomb reveal something more personal. There were chairs and beds, wooden chests, ceramic vessels, food containers, clothing, sandals, tools, cosmetic equipment, even everyday objects associated with grooming and domestic life. The collection is extraordinary because Egyptian tombs were designed to prepare the deceased for existence after death. Objects placed inside were not necessarily random possessions. They could serve symbolic purposes. They could provide food, comfort, clothing, equipment, or status in the next world. Yet Ka's burial appears to preserve far more than an abstract religious program. It gives the impression of an actual household. A bed retains traces of the world he inhabited. A box preserves objects associated with his personal life. Furniture reveals the level of comfort available to someone of his status. The tomb, therefore, becomes a kind of archaeological portrait. And perhaps that is where its deeper mystery begins. How much of what was placed inside reflected Ka's real life, and how much was chosen specifically for the afterlife? The distinction is difficult to make. Ancient Egyptians did not necessarily separate everyday existence from religious belief as sharply as modern societies often do. A bed could be useful in life and symbolically valuable after death. Food could be consumed physically or represented ritually. Clothing could demonstrate social status while also serving the deceased beyond the grave. Every object could have multiple meanings. Ka lived during Egypt's New Kingdom, a period of extraordinary wealth, military expansion, artistic achievement, and religious development. The exact dates of his life are debated, but his career is generally associated with the 18th dynasty. He served several pharaohs and was involved in royal construction projects. This means he belonged to a specialized professional class whose knowledge was essential to the construction of monumental architecture. The workers of Deir el-Medina were not ordinary laborers. They included skilled craftsmen, painters, sculptors, draftsmen, stoneworkers, and administrators responsible for creating the elaborately decorated tombs of kings and nobles. Ka's position connected him directly with this world. He understood how royal tombs were constructed. He would have known the rituals surrounding burial. He worked within a society that invested enormous resources in preparing the dead. And yet, when his own tomb was discovered, its contents suggested something surprisingly human. The man responsible for creating monumental spaces for others had his own modest chamber filled with objects connected to daily life. There is a quiet irony here. Ka helped build the eternal world of pharaohs. but the archaeological record remembers him largely because his own burial escaped disturbance. Most Egyptian tombs were eventually robbed. Their doors were opened, their treasures removed, their contents scattered. The tomb of Ka was different. It had been hidden successfully for more than 3,000 years. The reasons are not entirely mysterious. Its location and relatively discreet entrance likely helped protect it. But the survival of such a complete assemblage remains remarkable. When the chamber was opened, archaeologists found objects still arranged in ways that preserved relationships between them. This transformed the tomb into something more than an archaeological inventory. It became a rare window into ancient Egyptian material culture. Consider the food. Funerary provisions were intended to sustain the deceased, at least symbolically. Bread, vessels, and other supplies reflected the belief that existence continued beyond death. The Egyptians did not simply bury a person. They attempted to equip that person for another existence. And Ka's burial provides physical evidence of how that preparation worked. There were also cosmetics and personal care objects associated with merit. These details are especially revealing. They remind us that the people buried within Egyptian tombs were not merely names attached to monuments. They had routines. They dressed, they slept, they cared for their appearance. They owned possessions. They shared domestic spaces. Merit's presence also raises questions about the relationship between husband and wife within elite Egyptian society. The tomb was constructed for Ka, but the burial included his wife and her belongings. What did their household look like? How much time did they spend together? What roles did each person perform? Archaeology can suggest aspects of their lives, but it cannot recreate the conversations that once filled their home. This is one of the limitations and one of the attractions of the tomb. The objects are exceptionally well preserved, yet the people remain partly inaccessible. Their possessions survive. Their voices do not. There is another intriguing aspect of Ka's burial: the absence of monumental grandeur. Ka occupied an important position, yet his tomb did not rival the massive structures of kings. This reminds us that ancient Egyptian society was intensely hierarchical. Monumental architecture could express political power on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. But the majority of people lived within much smaller physical environments. Ka's tomb occupies an intermediate position. It reflects privilege, but not kingship. It provides an unusually detailed record of elite life without belonging to the royal family. This makes it especially useful to archaeologists. Instead of studying only the enormous monuments of pharaohs, researchers can examine the material world of someone who worked within the royal system. The contrast is revealing. The pharaoh's tomb was designed as a monumental expression of cosmic authority. Ka's burial is much more intimate. Its objects speak about domestic comfort, professional status, personal identity, and preparation for death. And yet, the religious dimension remains unmistakable. Ancient Egyptian funerary belief was complex. The deceased was expected to continue existing beyond physical death, but that existence depended on proper ritual treatment. The body needed protection. The name needed to survive. Offerings needed to be provided. Spiritual elements of the individual had to remain connected with the body and its funerary identity. This helps explain why tombs were filled with objects and inscriptions. They were not merely storage spaces. They were carefully constructed environments designed to support an ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. Ka's tomb, therefore, sits at the intersection of practical life and religious imagination. A wooden chest could be a household object. Inside a tomb, it became part of an eternal provision. A bed could represent ordinary domestic comfort. Within a burial chamber, it could become an object intended for continued existence. Food could nourish the living. In funerary context, it could symbolize sustenance beyond death. The distinction between reality and ritual becomes increasingly blurred, and this raises a more difficult question. Were the Egyptians attempting to preserve life itself, or were they attempting to preserve the identity of the individual after the body had ceased to function? Perhaps the answer was both. Ka's burial suggests that ancient Egyptians did not necessarily view death as an absolute end. Instead, death was a transformation requiring preparation. The tomb became a bridge between states of existence. That belief shaped architecture, art, language, and economics for thousands of years. But there is no need to invoke supernatural explanations to appreciate how sophisticated the system was. The organization of a tomb required planning. Funerary equipment required craftsmen. Food and clothing required resources. Rituals required trained specialists, and the entire process depended on a society capable of sustaining an enormous cultural investment in the dead. Ka stood within that system. He was both participant and beneficiary. He helped create the spaces where others would seek eternity, then entered that same world himself. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the discovery is its silence. The objects tell us that Ka and Merit lived in a world of extraordinary craftsmanship and deeply developed religious traditions. But when archaeologists opened the chamber, they were not simply looking at ancient artifacts. They were looking at the final arrangement made for two people whose daily lives had ended thousands of years earlier. The beds no longer held sleepers. The food had long since become dust. The clothing had survived as fragile remnants. The rooms of their former world had disappeared. Only the carefully preserved objects remained. And those objects have allowed modern researchers to reconstruct details that would otherwise have been lost completely. Yet, even an exceptionally preserved tomb has limits. We do not know exactly how Ka died. We cannot recover the final conversations between him and Merit. We cannot know precisely what they believed would happen after death. We cannot hear the rituals performed when their bodies were placed within the tomb. And we cannot know whether every object was selected from their actual household or deliberately acquired for funerary purposes. The chamber gives us evidence. It does not give us certainty. Perhaps that is why the tomb of Ka remains so compelling. Its mystery is not built around a missing treasure or an unexplained disappearance. It lies in something quieter. The extraordinary difficulty of recovering a human life from objects that have survived after the person themselves has disappeared. Ka's world can be measured through furniture, tools, clothing, food, inscriptions, and architecture. But somewhere between those artifacts lies a person we can never completely reconstruct. A craftsman and administrator who stood close to the construction of royal eternity. A husband whose household possessions survived when his home did not. A man who prepared monuments for the dead and eventually entered one himself. And inside the silence of his burial chamber, one question still remains. When Ka's tomb was sealed, did those who placed him there believe they had preserved his existence forever? Or were they simply leaving behind the strongest material memory they could create of a life that had already become unreachable?